Welcome back. If you are settling in right now, finding your position, letting the weight of the day begin to lift, then this is exactly the kind of story you have been waiting for. Tonight, we're going to travel across thousands of years and thousands of miles, not in a way that demands your full attention, but in a way that slowly pulls you into another world. The kind of world where great empires rose and collapsed on the strength of their navies, where merchants became kings and sailors became legends, where a body of water roughly the size of the continental United States became the most contested, most storied, most fiercely fought over stretch of ocean in all of human history. We are talking about the Mediterranean Sea, and the question we are asking tonight, a question that has no single clean answer, which is precisely what makes it so fascinating, is this: who really controlled it? Not just who claimed it on maps, not just whose flags flew above the harbours, but who truly understood it, who mastered its winds and its moods, who built empires on its rhythms, and who lost everything when those rhythms changed. Over the course of this story, we are going to move through civilizations like pages turning slowly in a very old book. We will begin with the Phoenicians, those shadowy, brilliant sailors from the coast of what is now Lebanon, the people who essentially invented Western trade. We will follow the Greeks as they planted cities across the sea like seeds in fertile soil. We will watch Carthage build an empire that terrified Rome for generations, and then we will watch Rome dismantle that empire piece by piece in one of history's most brutal series of wars. We will sail into the age of the Roman lake, that era when Rome called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, and genuinely meant it. Then the story gets stranger and richer. We will watch Rome fall apart, see the Byzantines hold the eastern half together with Greek fire and sheer stubbornness, watch Arab fleets surge out of the desert and onto the water in ways no one predicted, and discover, perhaps to your surprise, that Vikings once raided the shores of North Africa. We will spend time with the merchant republics of Venice and Genoa, where sea power and banking and organised violence all became intertwined in ways that still echo in the modern world. We will feel the shock of the Ottoman expansion and the desperate counterattack at the Battle of Lepanto, one of the last great clashes of oared warships in history. And then we will follow the story as the sea itself was slowly displaced from the centre of the world by new Atlantic trade routes, only to return to prominence in the 20th century when two world wars were partly decided on its waters. It is a long story, and that is entirely the point. The Mediterranean has been accumulating history for so long that every port city sits on layers of it. Every shipwreck on the seafloor is a frozen moment from a civilization that thought it would last forever. So let us begin at the beginning, or at least close to it, and let the story unfold slowly, the way the sea itself moves, with long swells and deep currents, unhurried and vast. To understand why anyone would fight so hard for the Mediterranean, you have to start with geography. Geography is destiny, as the saying goes, and in the case of the Mediterranean Sea, that statement is almost embarrassingly literal. The Mediterranean is not a particularly large body of water by global standards. It stretches roughly 2,500 miles from end to end, from the Strait of Gibraltar in the west to the coast of Lebanon in the east, and at its widest it is perhaps 900 miles across. The Atlantic Ocean dwarfs it. The Pacific could swallow it a dozen times over. And yet, for the better part of 4,000 years, this relatively modest inland sea was the fulcrum around which Western civilization turned. The reason begins with the land, around it. The Mediterranean basin is ringed by three continents: Europe to the north, Africa to the south, Asia to the east. And this extraordinary convergence meant that whoever could move freely across its waters had access to the resources, the peoples, and the ideas of three different worlds simultaneously. Timber from the forests of Lebanon, grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, copper from Cyprus, an island whose very name is the origin of our word for that metal, iron from Anatolia, olive oil, wine, dyes, ivory, silk passing overland from China and arriving at eastern ports. The Mediterranean was not just a sea, it was a marketplace, a highway, a battlefield, and a library, all at once. The sea's physical character shaped everything that happened on it. Unlike the wild, unpredictable Atlantic, the Mediterranean has relatively predictable wind patterns, especially in summer, when the Meltemi winds blow reliably from the north across the Aegean, and the maestro blows steadily across the western basin. Ancient sailors could read these patterns, plan their voyages around them, and largely trust that the sea in summer would be cooperative. Winter was another matter entirely. Between October and April, the Mediterranean could turn violent, churning with storms that sank ships without warning and closed harbours for weeks at a time. This is why ancient navies were fundamentally seasonal creatures. They could not maintain open water operations in winter without extraordinary risk, and most of them did not try. The sea's coastline is enormously complex. It is fractured into peninsulas, islands, bays, and straits in a way that created natural sheltering points, natural choke points, and natural staging areas for naval power. Sicily sits almost precisely in the middle of the sea, effectively dividing it into two halves, and whoever controlled Sicily controlled the passage between them. The Strait of Messina, the narrow channel between Sicily and the toe of Italy, was so tight and so turbulent that ancient sailors believed it was the home of Scylla and Charybdis, the twin monsters from Homer. The Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, at the eastern end of the sea, controlled access to the Black Sea and the grain routes of the Pontic steppes. Gibraltar, at the western end, was the gateway to the Atlantic. These choke points made the Mediterranean simultaneously open and controllable, vast enough to sail freely across, narrow enough at key points to be dominated by whoever held those gates. And then there are the islands: Crete, Cyprus, Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Aegean archipelago with its hundreds of smaller islands. Each of these was, at various times in history, a prize worth fighting over. Islands in the ancient world were not liabilities, they were assets. They provided safe harbours, fresh water, timber for ship repair, food for sailors, and positions from which naval power could be projected in multiple directions. An island in the right place was worth more than most cities on the mainland. Understanding all of this, the winds, the currents, the choke points, the islands, the seasonal rhythms, was the foundational knowledge upon which every maritime empire in Mediterranean history was built. The civilizations that thrived on this sea were the ones that invested in understanding it deeply, that developed the institutional knowledge of sailing, navigation, and seamanship over generations and centuries. The civilizations that failed were often those that tried to dominate the sea without first understanding it, or those that learned it and then forgot, through complacency, through conquest, through the simple erosion of institutional memory that happens when empires age. The story of who controlled the Mediterranean is really the story of who best understood it, and the first people who understood it deeply enough to build an empire on that understanding were a people that history has treated somewhat unkindly, remembered more for what others said about them than for what they left behind, partly because what they left behind turned to dust and ash, while the things they inspired in others lasted for millennia. They were the Phoenicians, and their story begins on a narrow coastal strip of land between the mountains of Lebanon and the eastern shore of the sea, in cities whose names still carry the weight of ancient commerce: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. Imagine standing on the waterfront of the city of Tyre around the year 1000 BCE. The city itself is built on a rocky island just off the coast of what is now southern Lebanon, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that was itself a later addition. The harbour is crowded with ships, broad-beamed merchant vessels with single masts and square sails, their hulls painted in the deep red-brown of cedarwood, their decks stacked with amphoras of wine and oil and cloth dyed in that astonishing purple that will come to define royalty across the Mediterranean world for the next 1,000 years. The city is noisy, productive, and intensely practical. The people who built it had looked at their geography: a thin strip of coast with no agricultural hinterland worth mentioning, hemmed in by mountains, surrounded by more powerful inland kingdoms, and had made a rational if audacious decision. They would not compete on land. They would conquer the sea. The Phoenicians, as the Greeks called them, the name likely derives from the Greek word for purple, phoinix, a reference to their most famous export, were the inheritors of a much older Canaanite maritime tradition. The cedar forests of Lebanon had been supplying timber to Egypt for ship and temple construction since the 3rd millennium BCE. Byblos, one of the northernmost Phoenician cities, was so deeply intertwined with Egyptian papyrus trade that the Greek word for book Byblos, comes from its name. These were people with roots so deep in Mediterranean commerce that by 1000 BCE they had already been at it, in various forms, for 2000 years. But it was in the centuries between roughly 1100 and 700 BCE that Phoenician maritime civilization reached its fullest expression. This period corresponds to what historians call the Early Iron Age, a time when the great Bronze Age palace civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians in their imperial form, had collapsed or contracted, leaving a power vacuum that the Phoenician city-states moved into with remarkable speed and confidence. Without a dominant imperial power to restrict their movements, Phoenician merchants sailed west, past Greece and Sicily, through the dangerous narrows at Gibraltar, and out into the Atlantic beyond. They established trading posts along the North African coast, on the southern coast of Spain, on the islands of Sardinia and Ibiza and Malta. These were not colonies in the Greek sense. They were not meant to be self-sufficient cities with their own political life. They were warehouses, refueling stops, workshops and market towns, the physical nodes of a commercial network that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the British Isles. The Phoenicians' most consequential contribution to history was almost certainly not a physical thing, but an idea, or more precisely, a system of notation. They developed one of the earliest true alphabets, a set of roughly 22 consonantal symbols from which all subsequent Western alphabets descend. The Greeks borrowed it and added vowels. The Romans borrowed it from the Greeks and adapted it further. The alphabet you're using to read, or rather the alphabet that someone used to write, these words is, at its deepest roots, a Phoenician invention. When we think about the Phoenicians, we should perhaps think of them as the people who gave language a portable form, who made it possible to record not just the inventories of palace, storerooms, but the stories and contracts and letters that bind civilizations together across distance and time. But for our purposes tonight, what matters most is what the Phoenicians did on the sea itself. Their merchant ships were sturdy, round-hulled vessels designed for cargo capacity rather than speed, capable of carrying heavy loads of metal ingots, timber, glass, another Phoenician innovation, and the precious purple dye that was their most exclusive product. This dye, extracted from murex sea snails in a process that was smelly, labour-intensive, and extraordinarily expensive, was so valuable that it became the colour of royalty across the ancient world. A single pound of Tyrian purple dye required the processing of approximately 9,000 murex snails. The colour did not fade. It deepened with age and sunlight. It was in every sense a luxury good for the ages, and it funded Phoenician maritime expansion for centuries. The Phoenicians also operated warships, long, narrow vessels rowed by crews of professional sailors, capable of speed and manoeuvrability in ways the merchant ships were not. These warships protected the merchant convoys, enforced trading agreements, and occasionally engaged in more overtly military operations, though the Phoenician city-states were never truly military empires in the way Rome or Assyria would be. They preferred negotiation to conquest, profitable arrangements to expensive wars. They were, in the most literal sense, merchants first. The greatest achievement of Phoenician maritime civilization was not Tyre or Sidon themselves, but the city their sailors founded on the coast of North Africa, probably in the late 9th century BCE, a city that would, centuries later, challenge Rome for dominance of the entire Mediterranean world. The story goes that a Phoenician princess named Elissa, known to Roman historians as Dido, fled from Tyre after her brother murdered her husband and led a group of refugees to the coast of what is now Tunisia, where she purchased from the local Berber king as much land as could be enclosed by a single ox hide. In the classic version of the story, she cut the hide into thin strips and used them to enclose a surprisingly large hill, on which she founded the city of Carthage. Khort-Hadast in the original Phoenician, the new city. Whether the story of Dido is literally true matters less than what it tells us about Carthaginian origins. Carthage was founded by people who were clever with limited resources, who maximized what they had, who turned constraints into advantages. These qualities would define Carthaginian civilization for the next 6 centuries, right up until Rome burned the city to the ground in 146 BCE and, according to some accounts, salted the earth to prevent anything from growing there again. The story of Carthage is one we will return to in detail, but first we need to watch the Greeks sail into the picture, because no account of Mediterranean power is complete without them. The Greeks came to the sea differently from the Phoenicians, where the Phoenicians were driven primarily by commerce, by the rational calculation that trading was more profitable than farming on their narrow coastal strip. The Greeks were driven by something more complex and harder to reduce to a single motivation. Overpopulation in some cases, political upheaval in others, simple wanderlust in a few, and always the restless competitive energy that characterized Greek culture from Homer onward. The Greeks had a word for it: agon, the spirit of contest, of striving, of measuring oneself against others and against the world. It shaped their athletics, their politics, their philosophy, and their relationship with the sea. Greek expansion across the Mediterranean began in earnest around 800 BCE and continued for roughly 3 centuries, a great diaspora of city planting that eventually scattered Greek-speaking communities from the Black Sea to the coast of Spain. Unlike the Phoenician trading posts, Greek colonies were genuinely independent cities, intended from the start to be permanent settlements with their own governments, their own local identities, their own relationships with the surrounding peoples. A Greek colony was not a warehouse, it was a daughter city, bound to its mother city by ties of culture, religion, and sentiment, but politically sovereign from the moment of its founding. The Greek world, therefore, did not expand by conquest in the way that empires expand. It expanded by replication. Whenever a Greek city grew too crowded, or whenever a political faction lost a struggle for power, or whenever a particularly bold group of citizens decided they wanted land of their own, a new colony was established somewhere along the vast coastline of the Mediterranean and Black Sea. The city of Massalia, modern Marseille, was founded by Greeks from Phocaea around 600 BCE. Syracuse in Sicily was founded by Corinth. Byzantium, the city that would eventually become Constantinople, was founded by Megara. Naples began as a Greek colony called Neapolis, the new city. The Greek presence in southern Italy was so dense that the Romans called the region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, long after Greek political power had faded. What made Greek maritime civilization distinctive was not just the scale of its expansion, but the sophistication of the technology it developed to make that expansion possible. The most important of these technologies was the trireme, a warship so ingeniously designed that it remained the dominant naval weapon in the Mediterranean for nearly 3 centuries. The trireme was a long, narrow, sharp-prowed vessel, powered by 170 oarsmen arranged on 3 levels, the rowers on each level offset from those above and below, in a complex arrangement that allowed the ship to concentrate enormous rowing power in a relatively compact hull. A trireme in full stroke could reach speeds of perhaps 7 or 8 knots, and in short bursts it could achieve something close to 10, fast enough to outmaneuver most other ships and to deliver its primary weapon, the bronze ram at its bow, with devastating force. A trireme properly handled could accelerate to ramming speed, strike an enemy vessel on the side or stern, backwater immediately, and pull free before the enemy could respond. It was essentially a weapon of pure kinetic energy, a giant human-powered projectile. The trireme required extraordinary coordination to operate. All 170 oarsmen had to pull in perfect synchrony, responding to the rhythm of the flute player who sat amidships and kept the beat, and responding to the helm commands of the trierarch, the captain, who in Athenian practice was a wealthy citizen who funded the ship's operation as a form of civic duty. Greek trireme crews were highly trained, physically conditioned, and deeply experienced. The best of them, particularly the Athenian crews of the 5th century BCE, were acknowledged as the finest oarsmen in the Mediterranean world. It was the trireme and Athens' investment in building a fleet of them that defined the critical turning point in early Mediterranean history, the moment when Greek civilization came within a hair's breadth of being extinguished by Persia, and survived. The story of the Persian Wars is one of the great dramatic narratives of the ancient world, and the naval dimension of that story deserves more attention than it typically receives. When the Persian king Xerxes launched his enormous invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, he brought with him not just a vast land army. Ancient sources give obviously exaggerated figures in the millions, but modern estimates still suggest something in the range of 150,000 to 250,000 men, an astonishing force for the period, but also a fleet of perhaps 800 to 1,200 warships. Against this, the Greek alliance could muster perhaps 370 triremes in total, of which Athens provided roughly half. The odds were not good. The Athenian statesman Themistocles had seen the Persian threat coming years earlier, and had used the revenues from a newly discovered silver lode at Laurium to build exactly the fleet that Athens would need. He had also developed the strategy that would save Greece, not fighting the Persians on land, where their numbers would overwhelm any Greek force, but forcing them to fight at sea, in confined waters where the Persian advantage in numbers would be neutralized, and where Greek seamanship and trireme tactics could tip the balance. The Bay of Salamis was chosen for the decisive engagement. It is a narrow stretch of water between the island of Salamis and the mainland of Attica, and Themistocles manoeuvred the Persian fleet into it before dawn on a late September morning in 480 BCE. The Persian ships, many of them crewed by Phoenicians and Egyptians who were fighting under compulsion rather than conviction, were packed too tightly to use their numerical advantage effectively. When the Greek triremes attacked in the early morning light, ramming and backing and manoeuvring with practiced precision, the Persian formation collapsed. The Greek historian Aeschylus, who fought at Salamis as a soldier and later wrote about the battle in his play The Persians, described the water thick with wreckage and bodies, the cries of the drowning mixing with the shouts of victorious Greek sailors. Salamis did not end the Persian wars. There was still a land battle to be fought at Plataea the following year, but it broke the Persian invasion's strategic coherence. Without a functioning fleet to supply his army and maintain his lines of communication, Xerxes could not sustain a deep penetration into Greece. He withdrew with the bulk of his forces, leaving a rearguard that was subsequently defeated. Greece survived, and with Greece, the particular tradition of independent city-states, competitive philosophy, democratic, experimentation, and intellectual openness that would eventually flow into the mainstream of Western civilization. The aftermath of the Persian Wars transformed the power dynamics of the Greek world in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. Athens, whose fleet had been the decisive factor in the Greek victory, emerged from the wars with an enormous naval advantage and an equally enormous sense of its own destiny. Within a generation, the Athenians had converted the defensive Delian League, a voluntary alliance of Greek city-states formed to resist any future Persian attack, into something that looked very much like an empire. Member cities that tried to leave were forced back into the alliance by Athenian warships. The treasury of the League was moved from the sacred island of Delos to Athens. The money was spent on Athenian buildings, most famously the Parthenon. Allied cities paid tribute that was, in practical terms, indistinguishable from taxation by a conquering power. This Athenian empire, brief as it was, it lasted from roughly 479 to 404 BCE before Sparta and its allies dismantled it, was the first true naval empire in Mediterranean history. Athens demonstrated that control of the sea translated directly into political power, economic wealth, and cultural dominance. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten. While the Greeks were busy building their network of colonies and fighting their wars among themselves and against Persia, the city that Dido had founded on the coast of North Africa was quietly becoming the most powerful commercial and naval force in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, prosperous, pragmatic, and intensely secretive, had by the 5th century BCE established a dominance over Western Mediterranean trade that was both comprehensive and ruthlessly maintained. The Carthaginians had learned their commercial instincts from their Phoenician ancestors, and they had refined those instincts over centuries into something approaching a systematic monopoly on Western Mediterranean commerce. Their trading network extended from North Africa across to Spain, from Sardinia and Sicily down to the edge of sub-Saharan Africa, and from the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic in both directions, north toward Britain, where they obtained tin, and south along the African coast, where they obtained gold and ivory and exotic animals. They guarded the secrets of these routes with extraordinary jealousy. Ancient sources describe Carthaginian captains who, when followed by foreign ships, deliberately ran their own vessels aground on hidden shoals rather than reveal the route they were sailing. The sailors were compensated by the Carthaginian state for the loss of their ships. The information was considered more valuable than the vessels. We know frustratingly little about Carthaginian civilization from the inside, and this is not an accident of archaeology. It is a consequence of deliberate destruction. When Rome finally defeated Carthage in 146 BCE and razed the city to the ground, the Library of Carthage, which must have been substantial for a civilization of that antiquity and sophistication, was either burned or dispersed. Almost everything we know about Carthage comes filtered through Greek and Roman sources, which is roughly like trying to understand the French Revolution through accounts written exclusively by British royalists. The sources are not entirely wrong, but they are shaped by the needs and prejudices of people who considered Carthage an enemy. One of the most persistent accusations against the Carthaginians in ancient sources is the practice of child sacrifice, the Topheth, as it was called, the burning place where children were allegedly offered to the gods Baal-Hamon and Tanit in times of crisis. Archaeological evidence does confirm the existence of the Topheth as a burial ground for infants and young children. But whether these deaths were sacrificial or merely the graves of children who died young, in a society with high infant mortality rates remains hotly debated among modern scholars. The Carthaginians are unlikely to ever be able to defend themselves, which is precisely why the accusation has proven so durable. Conquered peoples rarely get to control their own narratives. What is not debated is the extraordinary sophistication of Carthaginian naval power. By the 5th century BCE, the Carthaginians had developed a fighting fleet that was both technically advanced and highly professional. Their warships were built to a standard design, with interchangeable parts that could be fabricated in advance and assembled quickly, allowing Carthage to build or repair ships at a speed that no other Mediterranean naval power of the period could match. They maintained a permanent professional naval establishment, sailors, shipwrights, navigators, rather than relying on levied citizens the way Athens and other Greek city-states did. Their harbours at Carthage itself were engineering marvels, a rectangular commercial harbour connected by a channel to a circular military harbour, from which warships could be deployed rapidly in any direction. The military harbour, called the Kothon, was a circular basin with a diameter of roughly 325 metres, ringed with covered ship sheds that could house as many as 220 warships simultaneously. At the centre of the circular basin was an island from which the admiral could observe the entire harbour and issue orders. The whole complex was designed for efficiency and security. Ships could be brought out in order, dispatched quickly, and returned to their sheds without the confusion that plagued open anchorages. It was, in essence, a purpose-built naval base centuries before the concept was standard practice in Western warfare. For most of the 5th century BCE, Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily existed in an uneasy equilibrium, trading, competing, and occasionally fighting along the borders of their respective spheres of influence. Sicily was the great prize in the western Mediterranean, the largest island in the sea, fertile, strategically central, controlling the passage between the sea's two halves. The western part of Sicily was Carthaginian. The eastern part was dominated by the Greek city of Syracuse. The line between them was never stable, and both sides knew it. The Great Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415 to 413 BCE, one of the most catastrophic military failures in ancient history, an invasion force of more than 40,000 men that ended with the destruction of virtually the entire Athenian fleet and the death or enslavement of virtually the entire army, shifted the balance significantly toward Carthage. Athens had been the only Greek power capable of challenging Carthaginian naval supremacy in western waters, and now Athens was broken. Syracuse was weakened. Carthage expanded its Sicilian holdings, establishing control over the western third of the island and a series of tributary cities in between. The relationship between Carthage and Rome in this period was actually quite cordial. The first treaty between the two powers, which the Roman historian Polybius claims to have personally seen inscribed in archaic Latin in the Roman archives, dates to approximately 509 BCE, the traditional first year of the Roman Republic. Under this treaty, Rome and its allies agreed not to trade or settle in Libya, Sardinia, or the western part of Sicily, essentially acknowledging Carthaginian monopoly rights over those areas. In return, Carthage promised not to harm Rome or its allies in Italy. It was a treaty between a major naval power and a relatively minor Italian city-state, and at the time it was signed, no one on either side could possibly have imagined what the relationship would eventually become. For the next 2.5 centuries, Carthage continued its expansion in the western Mediterranean, while Rome slowly, bloodily, expanded across the Italian peninsula. Their trajectories were on a collision course, though neither side fully understood this yet. The collision, when it finally came, would transform the entire Mediterranean world. Rome was not, by origin or tradition or temperament, a naval power. The Romans were farmers who became soldiers, soldiers who became administrators, administrators who became emperors. But sailors they never particularly became, at least not willingly. The sea made the Romans uncomfortable in a way that mountains and rivers and deserts did not. Roman generals were accustomed to fighting enemies they could see directly, on ground they could walk on, with weapons they could hold in their hands. The sea was none of those things, and yet the logic of Roman expansion, which was relentless and often seemed to operate independently of any central will, eventually brought Rome to the water's edge and demanded that it step in. The specific occasion was Sicily, that great island in the middle of the Mediterranean that everyone who wanted to control the sea eventually had to deal with. The First Punic War began in 264 BCEE, when Rome intervened in a dispute between the city of Messana in northeastern Sicily and the Carthaginian-backed tyrant of Syracuse. The reasons for Rome's intervention are debated even today, but the consequences are not. What began as a localized Italian power play escalated, with the inexorable logic of great power competition, into a full-scale war between the two dominant powers of the western Mediterranean. A war that would be fought primarily at sea on terms that Rome was catastrophically unprepared for. The Romans realized almost immediately that they could not fight this war successfully without a navy. Carthage had been a naval power for centuries. Rome had almost none. The ancient sources tell a story that is almost certainly apocryphal but captures the spirit of Roman pragmatism beautifully. The Romans found a wrecked Carthaginian warship on the beach, studied it carefully, and within 60 days had used it as a template to build a fleet of 100 copies, simultaneously training their rowers on benches set up on dry land while the ships were being constructed. The reality was somewhat less miraculous but no less impressive. Rome did build a substantial fleet quickly, drawing on the naval expertise of its Italian allies, particularly the Greeks of southern Italy, who had generations of seafaring experience, and it did so with a speed that astonished contemporaries. But the Romans knew they could not match Carthaginian seamanship in open water, at least not initially, so they solved the problem in the most Roman way possible. They turned a naval battle into a land battle. The device that accomplished this was called the corvus, which means raven in Latin. It was a boarding bridge mounted on a pivot at the prow of a Roman warship, with a heavy iron spike at its business end. When a Roman ship drew close to an enemy vessel, the corvus was swung out and dropped onto the enemy deck, the spike punching through the planking to lock the two ships together. Roman legionaries then poured across the boarding bridge and fought the kind of close-quarters infantry battle at which they excelled. The enemy's superior seamanship was suddenly irrelevant. You cannot outmaneuver a ship that is physically attached to yours. The corvus worked spectacularly well in the early years of the war. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the first major engagement of the First Punic War, a Roman fleet under Gaius Duilius used the corvus to capture or destroy 50 Carthaginian ships, in what was, by ancient naval standards, a comprehensive victory. Duilius was awarded a triumph, the highest Roman military honour, and a column decorated with ship's prows was erected in the Roman Forum to commemorate the victory. Fragments of this column, the Columna Rostrata, survive to this day. But the war was not won at Mylae, and it would not be won for another 20 years. The First Punic War ground on through victories and defeats, through spectacular Roman naval disasters, storms that sank entire fleets at a blow, with losses that would qualify as catastrophic even by the standards of the world wars, and through a Carthaginian military revival led by a general named Hamilcar Barca, whose genius for land warfare in Sicily kept Carthage in the fight, even after Rome had established clear naval superiority. The Roman losses to storms deserve particular emphasis, because they illustrate one of the central challenges of Mediterranean naval power that every empire on this sea would have to grapple with. In 255 BCE, a Roman fleet returning from a failed invasion of Africa was caught in a storm off the southern coast of Sicily and virtually destroyed. Ancient sources give figures of 270 ships and 100,000 men lost. The numbers are probably exaggerated, but the scale of the disaster is not in doubt. In 254 BCE, another storm destroyed 150 Roman ships. In 249 BCE, the Roman admiral Publius Claudius Pulcher suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Drepana, losing 93 ships, partly as a result of ignoring an unfavourable omen from the sacred chickens he was required to consult before battle. When the chickens refused to eat before the battle, Claudius reportedly threw them into the sea, declaring that if they would not eat, they could drink. The gods, or at least the Carthaginians, punished him for his impiety. The war ended in 241 BCE, not through any dramatic decisive engagement, but through exhaustion. Both sides were financially drained, their populations depleted by years of casualties. The Romans built yet another fleet, funded this time by voluntary contributions from wealthy Roman citizens, since the state treasury was empty, and won a final naval victory at the Aegates Islands that cut Carthage's supply lines to its Sicilian army. Hamilcar Barca, still undefeated in the field, was forced to negotiate. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Carthaginians also agreed to pay an enormous indemnity, 3,200 silver talents, a sum so large that it took them 10 years to pay off. The peace lasted 20 years. Then came the Second Punic War, and with it, one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the history of the ancient world. A campaign built not on naval power but on an audacious land strategy that would reshape the Mediterranean world and secure the name Hannibal Barca in military history for all time. Hannibal Barca is one of those figures in history who seems to exceed the normal bounds of human capability, who appears in the narrative as almost mythological, even though the facts of his life are sufficiently astonishing without embellishment. He was the eldest son of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general who had fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily, and he grew up in his father's military camp from childhood. The story is told that as a boy of 9 he begged to accompany his father to Spain, and when Hamilcar asked if he truly wanted to come, Hannibal swore on the altar of the gods that he would spend his life as Rome's enemy. The oath became one of the most famous in ancient history. By 218 BCE, Hannibal was 30 years old and in command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain. He had spent years consolidating Carthaginian power in the Iberian Peninsula, fighting local tribes, extending the silver mine revenues that funded Carthaginian power, and building an army of exceptional quality: Iberian infantry, Numidian cavalry, North African veterans, and the war elephants that would become his most famous weapon. And then, in a move that still astonishes military historians, he decided to attack Rome not by sea, where Carthage had lost the advantage, but overland, through southern France and across the Alps. The Alps crossing is the part of Hannibal's story that most people know, at least in outline. In the autumn of 218 BCE, Hannibal led an army of approximately 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants across the passes of the Western Alps, in a journey that took 15 days and cost him roughly half his force to the combined atrocities of mountain cold, treacherous paths, and hostile local tribes. When he descended into northern Italy, he had perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left, and the elephants had fared badly. Most would not survive the winter. By any reasonable military calculus, the campaign should have been over before it started. Instead, Hannibal spent the next 16 years in Italy, winning battle after battle against Roman armies that outnumbered him significantly, living off the land, recruiting allies among Rome's Italian subjects, and demonstrating a tactical genius that military schools still study. At the Trebia River in December 218 BCE, he destroyed a Roman army in a perfectly executed ambush. At Lake Trasimene in June 217 BCE, he annihilated another Roman force in one of history's most dramatic ambushes, catching an entire army on a narrow road between the lake and the hills, and killing perhaps 15,000 men in a battle that lasted less than 3 hours. At Cannae in August 216 BCE, he engineered what military historians consider the most perfect battlefield victory in the pre-modern era, surrounding a Roman army of perhaps 70,000 men with a smaller force and destroying it almost entirely, killing perhaps 47,000 Romans in a single afternoon, including 2 consuls, 29 military tribunes, 80 senators, and a significant fraction of Rome's aristocratic officer class. Cannae shook Rome to its foundations. The city had never suffered a defeat of this magnitude, never seen its aristocracy decimated in a single afternoon. Ancient sources describe the sounds of wailing throughout the city as the casualty lists were read, describe the desperate measures taken to placate the gods, including the live burial of 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks in the Roman Forum, a practice so un-Roman that its occurrence signals the depth of the panic. Several Italian allies defected to Hannibal's side. Capua, Rome's second city, opened its gates. For a brief vertiginous moment it seemed possible that Rome itself might fall. It did not fall, for reasons that bring us back to the sea and to the question of who controls it. Hannibal's strategic plan had always depended on 2 things that never fully materialized: the defection of enough Italian allies to deprive Rome of its manpower base, and the arrival of reinforcements and supplies from Carthage and Spain. The first failed because most Italian cities, even after Cannae, remained loyal to Rome out of a combination of fear, calculation, and genuine political attachment. The second failed largely because Rome, despite its catastrophic losses on land, maintained enough naval power to disrupt Carthaginian supply operations across the western Mediterranean. This is the central irony of the Hannibalic War. The greatest land general of the ancient world was ultimately undone by sea power that he could not control. Carthage sent some reinforcements, most notably Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, who made his own Alps crossing in 208 BCE, but Hasdrubal was intercepted and killed at the Battle of the Metaurus River in northern Italy before he could link up with his brother. The story is told that the Romans sent Hasdrubal's severed head to Hannibal's camp, and that Hannibal looked at it for a long time before saying that he could see in it the end of Carthage's fortunes. Meanwhile, a young Roman general of extraordinary ability was doing to Carthage in Spain exactly what Hannibal had done to Rome in Italy, fighting brilliant, aggressive campaigns that steadily dismantled Carthaginian power in the Iberian Peninsula. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he would eventually earn the cognomen Africanus for what he did next. Having deprived Carthage of its Spanish revenues and its ability to reinforce Hannibal, Scipio proposed the boldest Roman strategic move of the entire war: an invasion of North Africa, directly attacking Carthage on its home ground. The Roman Senate was deeply reluctant. Rome was exhausted from 16 years of war, and sending an army to Africa while Hannibal was still loose in Italy seemed like an act of madness. But Scipio was persuasive, and the Senate eventually authorized a limited expedition. When Scipio landed in North Africa in 204 BCE, Carthage was forced to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. The 2 greatest generals of their age met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, and Scipio won, neutralizing the Numidian cavalry that had been Hannibal's crucial advantage in every previous battle, and using his own superior cavalry arm to sweep around the Carthaginian flanks. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were devastating: the surrender of all remaining warships except 10, the payment of a staggering indemnity, the surrender of Spain and all other overseas territories, and the prohibition of any war-making outside Africa without Roman permission. Carthage was reduced from a major power to a client state, permitted to exist but not to threaten. The western Mediterranean was now, for practical purposes, a Roman lake. But the eastern Mediterranean was still contested, still home to Greek kingdoms of considerable power, still not yet fully within Rome's grasp. The transformation of the entire sea into Roman territory would take another century and a half, and it would not be completed by military conquest alone. The phrase Mare Nostrum, our sea, appears in Roman literature from roughly the 1st century BCE onward, and it captures something important about how the Romans eventually came to think of the Mediterranean, not as a foreign territory to be crossed or a barrier to be overcome, but as a possession, a patrimony, an extension of Roman sovereignty. The Mediterranean was Roman in the same way that the Italian countryside was Roman, with the same assumption of ownership and the same expectation of order. Getting to that point was a process that took roughly 300 years, from the end of the First Punic War in 241 BCE to the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony At Actium in 31 BCE, when the last independent naval power in the Mediterranean was extinguished, and Augustus Caesar became the undisputed master of a sea that stretched from Gibraltar to the Levant. Along the way, Rome fought not just Carthage, but the Macedonian kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire, the Kingdom of Pontus, and its own internal civil wars. Wars that were as damaging to Roman sea power as any foreign enemy had been. The pace of Roman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean accelerated dramatically after the defeat of Carthage. Without Carthaginian power to worry about in the west, Rome could turn its attention eastward, where the successors of Alexander the Great had divided the eastern Mediterranean among themselves. The kingdoms of Macedon, Syria, Egypt, and Pergamon had all emerged from the fragmentation of Alexander's empire, and had spent the next century fighting each other with the weary, inconclusive warfare that happens when no single power is strong enough to dominate all the others. Rome arrived in this landscape with fresh energy and fresh armies, and it transformed the balance of power with a speed that astonished the Greeks. The Macedonian Wars of the early 2nd century BCE ended with the dissolution of the Macedonian kingdom. The Seleucid Empire was pushed out of Asia Minor and forced to surrender its Mediterranean coastline. Egypt was too useful as a client. It supplied Rome with enormous quantities of grain, and too weak to resist, so it remained technically independent while becoming practically dependent. By 133 BCE, when the last king of Pergamon died and left his kingdom to Rome in his will, the entire eastern Mediterranean littoral was either Roman territory or firmly within Rome's sphere of influence. But the Roman Mediterranean was not yet truly pacified, and the reason was pirates. Mediterranean piracy in the ancient world was not a marginal criminal activity. It was an endemic problem that at various times threatened to disrupt the entire food supply of Rome itself. Pirates did not merely rob individual ships. At their peak of activity in the 1st century BCE, pirate fleets numbering in the hundreds of ships operated from bases in Cilicia, in southern Anatolia, raiding coastal cities, kidnapping wealthy travellers for ransom, intercepting grain shipments, and operating with a freedom that reflected the absence of any coherent Roman naval response. The scale of the problem is illustrated by one of history's more ironic anecdotes. Julius Caesar, in his late 20s and not yet famous, was captured by Cilician pirates in 75 BCE while sailing to Rhodes. The pirates held him for ransom, demanding 20 talents of silver, a substantial sum. Caesar reportedly told them, with the casual arrogance of a Roman aristocrat, that they were undervaluing him and that he would pay 50 talents. He also promised jovially that he would return and have them all crucified once he was released. The pirates apparently found this threat amusing from a man in their power. Caesar was released when the ransom was paid, immediately organised a naval force, hunted down the pirates within weeks, and had them all crucified. He had the throats cut first, as an act of mercy. They had treated him well during his captivity. The systematic solution to Mediterranean piracy came in 67 BCE, when the Roman Senate passed an extraordinary law granting the general Gnaeus Pompey, already known as Pompey the Great for his victories in various campaigns, sweeping powers to operate against pirates throughout the entire Mediterranean. The command was unprecedented in its scope. Pompey was given authority over the entire sea and over coastal territories extending 50 miles inland, effectively giving him the authority of a temporary maritime dictator. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 districts, assigned a fleet and a subordinate commander to each, and coordinated a simultaneous sweep. Of all areas, Pompey destroyed Mediterranean piracy in 40 days, not reduced it, not suppressed it temporarily, but functionally eliminated it as an organised force in the space of 6 weeks. The pirate bases in Cilicia were attacked before the pirates could concentrate their forces for a coordinated defence. Intercepted pirate fleets, finding themselves cut off from retreat, surrendered in large numbers. Pompey's solution for the surrendered pirates was characteristically Roman in its pragmatism. Rather than killing them all, which would have simply sent their survivors back to piracy, he settled them in agricultural communities in areas that needed population, giving them land and a livelihood that did not depend on raiding. Within a generation, most of them had simply become farmers. The elimination of piracy transformed the economic geography of the Roman Mediterranean almost instantly. Shipping costs fell as risk premiums dropped. The volume of trade increased. Roman Merchants extended their operations into areas that had previously been too dangerous. Most importantly for Rome itself, the grain supply from Egypt and North Africa flowed more reliably, reducing the chronic threat of urban food shortages that had been a constant source of political instability in the capital. The Mediterranean under Rome at its height was an extraordinarily efficient economic system. Roman roads connected the interior to the coast. Roman ships connected the coast to each other. Roman law provided a standardized framework for commercial contracts and dispute resolution. Roman currency provided a common medium of exchange from Britain to Mesopotamia. The sea itself served as the backbone of this system, a highway that was, in the right season and with reasonable luck, faster and cheaper than any overland route. A cargo of grain from Alexandria to Rome, a journey of roughly 1,500 miles, could be accomplished in perhaps 10 days in favourable winds. The same journey, overland, would have taken months and cost many times more. The great ports of the Roman Mediterranean were engineering achievements of the first order. Ostia, Rome's harbour at the mouth of the Tiber, was reconstructed and expanded under the Emperor Claudius in the mid-1st century CE to include an artificial harbour of 200 hectares, protected by 2 curved moles of stone and equipped with warehouses, cranes, lighthouses, and administrative facilities. Caesarea Maritima on the coast of Judea, built by Herod the Great in the late 1st century BCE, used hydraulic concrete, a Roman innovation that set in seawater, to construct a fully artificial harbour on an otherwise harbourless coast. Carthage, rebuilt as a Roman city after its destruction, became the 2nd or 3rd largest city in the empire and the greatest commercial port in the western Mediterranean. And then there was Alexandria, the city at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that was in many ways the intellectual and commercial capital of the Roman world, even though it was technically just a provincial capital. To understand Alexandria and what it meant for the control of the Mediterranean, we need to step back a little in time and look at the civilization that built it. Alexander the Great founded approximately 70 cities across his conquests, most of them named Alexandria in a fit of either confidence or narcissism, but only one of them became one of the most important cities in human history. The Alexandria at the western edge of the Nile Delta, on a strip of land between the sea and a shallow lake, was chosen with the same geographical instinct that Alexander showed in all his strategic decisions. It was a natural harbour protected by the island of Pharos, accessible to the grain wealth of the Nile Valley, and positioned to become the commercial nexus between the Mediterranean world and the trade routes of the Indian Ocean, which reached Egypt through the Red Sea. Alexander died in 323 BCE before he could see what Alexandria became. It was his general Ptolemy who inherited Egypt and who transformed Alexandria into the city that would astonish the ancient world. The city of the lighthouse and the library of philosophers and merchants and mathematicians, of a population that eventually exceeded 500,000 people and made it the largest city in the world outside of China. The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, was completed around 280 BCE under Ptolemy II, and it was immediately recognized as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood on the island of Pharos at the harbour entrance, a structure of limestone and granite rising to an estimated height of perhaps 130 to 140 metres. For over 1,000 years it was among the tallest structures in the world, surpassed only by the Great Pyramid at Giza, which is visible on a clear day from Alexandria. At its top a fire burned continuously, reflected by polished bronze mirrors to produce a beam of light visible, according to ancient sources, from as far as 50 kilometres out to sea. The light guided ships into the harbour not just as a navigational aid, but as a symbol. The physical embodiment of a city that wanted the world to know where it was. The library was the other great symbol of Ptolemaic Alexandria, and in some ways it is even more remarkable than the lighthouse. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a collection of books, it was the most ambitious intellectual project of the ancient world, an attempt to gather all existing human knowledge into a single place and make it available to the scholars who came from across the Mediterranean to work with it. The Ptolemies pursued this goal with what we might recognize today as the approach of very wealthy people who are genuinely passionate about their subject. They sent agents throughout the Mediterranean to buy or copy manuscripts. They required all ships entering Alexandria's harbour to surrender any books on board for copying before they were returned, They hired the finest scholars of the age to work at the library and adjacent research institute called the Mouseion, and they spent lavishly on the whole enterprise. The result was extraordinary. At its height, the Library of Alexandria may have contained between 500,000 and 700,000 scrolls, the equivalent of perhaps 100,000 modern books, representing the accumulated literary and scientific output of Greek civilization, and whatever could be collected of Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Indian knowledge. The scholars who worked there included Euclid, who compiled the foundations of geometry as we still teach them, Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than the angle of shadows and a knowledge of the distance between two Egyptian cities, Archimedes, who worked out the principles of the lever and the screw and buoyancy and a great deal else besides, and Hipparchus, who developed the first systematic catalogue of stars and laid the foundations of trigonometry. For our purposes, what matters about Alexandria is its role in the commercial and naval control of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt under the Ptolemies was the richest province in the Mediterranean world, and Alexandria was the funnel through which that wealth flowed. The grain of the Nile Valley, the luxury goods from the Indian Ocean trade, the papyrus that the entire Mediterranean used for writing, all of it passed through Alexandria's harbours, generating enormous customs revenues that funded the Ptolemaic court and military. The Ptolemaic navy was at one point the largest in the Mediterranean, with warships of extraordinary size. The ancient sources describe vessels of 7, 8, and even more banks of oars, ships so large that they were essentially floating fortresses, almost impossible to sink by conventional ramming, but equally impossible to manoeuvre with any precision. These floating monsters were probably more useful as status symbols and morale boosters than as practical weapons of war, and the Ptolemaic navy gradually declined from its peak in the early 3rd century BCE as the dynasty grew decadent and absorbed in its own court. Intrigues. By the time Rome arrived on the scene, Egypt was in no position to resist. The last of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra VII, not the first woman to bear that name in the dynasty, nor the most capable ruler, but certainly the most famous, for reasons that have everything to do with her relationships with two of Rome's most powerful men, and almost nothing to do with her actual political abilities, which were considerable. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's independence depended on playing Roman factions against each other, and for a time she did it successfully. She allied with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. When Antony's conflict with Octavian, the future Augustus, reached its climax at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra was present with her own fleet, positioned to intervene. The battle was a disaster. Antony's fleet, numerically superior to Octavian's, was poorly coordinated and demoralized by months of stalemate and disease. When Cleopatra's squadron broke through the blockade and sailed south, it is debated to this day whether she was fleeing, implementing a pre-agreed plan, or simply making a rational calculation that the battle was lost. Antony followed her. The rest of his fleet, leaderless, eventually surrendered or burned. A year later, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead by their own hands, and Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire not as a province, but as the personal possession of Augustus, a place so wealthy and so strategically important that no senator was allowed to visit it without imperial permission, lest the control of Egypt's grain supply give some ambitious man the leverage to challenge the emperor himself. With Egypt secured, the Mediterranean was truly Roman. The sea that had been contested for centuries between Phoenicians and Greeks, between Carthage and Rome, between Rome and the Eastern kingdoms, was now, at long last, in a single pair of hands. For the next 400 years, those hands held it. 400 years is a long time to hold anything, and empires do not age gracefully. The Roman Empire in its later centuries was not the confident, expansive power of Augustus and Trajan and Hadrian. It was something more embattled, more anxious, perpetually fighting off pressures from beyond its frontiers, while managing growing internal instability in the provinces and in the capital. The crisis of the 3rd century CE, when the empire nearly fragmented completely under the combined pressure of barbarian invasions and a rapid succession of short-lived military emperors, sometimes 2 or 3 per year, most of them dying violently, left permanent scars on Roman institutional capability that the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine could repair but not fully heal. The Mediterranean during these centuries of late Roman decline was still, formerly a Roman see. Roman trade continued. Roman warships still patrolled the major sea lanes, though less, systematically and less effectively than in the High Imperial period. The great port still functioned. Alexandria still exported grain. But the margin of control was thinner, the response to threats slower, the institutional knowledge of seamanship less reliably maintained. When the barbarian kingdoms began establishing themselves in the western provinces in the 5th century CE, one of them, the Vandals, demonstrated what a determined enemy could do with a sea that Rome was no longer adequately defending. The Vandals are remembered mostly through the verb their name inspired, vandalism, which tells you something about how thoroughly they were demonized in the historical record. They were, in reality, a sophisticated Germanic people who had spent decades crossing the length of the Roman Empire from their original homeland in what is now Poland, through Gaul and Spain, and across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. In North Africa, under their king Genseric, one of the most capable political and military minds of the 5th century. They established a kingdom centered on Carthage that became, ironically, the most powerful naval force in the western Mediterranean. Genseric understood immediately what possessing Carthage meant. It meant possessing the natural base for naval operations in the central Mediterranean, the same harbour complex that Carthage had used for centuries to project power across the sea. He rebuilt the Carthaginian fleet, recruited experienced sailors from the local population, many of whom had been seafarers under Roman rule, and launched a series of raids against the Mediterranean coastline that Rome was utterly unable to prevent. In 455 CE, a Vandal fleet sailed up the Tiber and sacked Rome itself, carrying off enormous quantities of treasure, including, according to some sources, the Temple of Jerusalem's menorah that Titus had brought to Rome 4 centuries earlier after the destruction of Jerusalem. The sack of Rome by Vandals in 455 CE was not the end of the Western Roman Empire. That is usually dated to 476 CE, when the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. But the Vandal naval dominance was a powerful symbol of how thoroughly the Western Mediterranean had fractured. No single power now controlled the sea. The Vandals held North Africa and raided the coasts at will. The Visigoths were in Spain. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy. The Franks were in Gaul. The eastern half of the empire, centred on Constantinople, still existed as a going concern. It would continue to exist in various forms for nearly another 1,000 years, but its ability to project power into the Western Mediterranean was limited. Into this fragmented landscape, 2 new forces would eventually emerge to contest control of the sea, with the surviving Eastern Empire. One was the Kingdom of the Franks, which under Charlemagne in the late 8th century created something like a restored Western Empire. But Charlemagne's power was fundamentally continental, built on cavalry and infantry rather than ships, and the Franks never developed the naval capability needed to project power across the Mediterranean. The other force was far more radical and far more transformative. It came from the desert, and it arrived on the sea with a speed and ferocity that no one in the Mediterranean world had anticipated. Before we follow the Arab expansion onto the Mediterranean, we need to spend time with the civilization that held the eastern end of the sea together through 5 centuries of chaos. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the civilization that called itself Roman long after the West had forgotten what that word meant. Byzantium, named for the ancient Greek city on the Bosphorus around which Constantine built his new capital in 330 CE, was in many ways Rome's strangest and most durable legacy. It spoke Greek, rather than Latin. Its emperor wore robes of gold and silk and received his subjects with an elaborate court ceremonial that the old Romans would have found alien. Its theology was an intricate, passionate, perpetually contested engagement with Christian doctrine that produced some of history's most sophisticated philosophical arguments, as well as some of its most violent religious riots. And yet the Byzantines considered themselves heirs of Rome, guardians of Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman military tradition, and in the matter of controlling the Mediterranean, they took that guardianship very seriously indeed. The strategic heart of Byzantine power was Constantinople itself, and the key to Constantinople's defensibility was its geography. The city sat at the meeting point of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and the Golden Horn, a sheltered inlet that served as the imperial harbour. The land walls of Constantinople, built by the Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, were so formidably constructed that they would repel every assault for over 1,000 years, until the Ottomans finally breached them with gunpowder artillery in 1453. But the sea walls protecting the city's flanks along the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara were equally important, and the ultimate guardian of those sea walls was the most terrifying naval weapon of the medieval world: Greek fire. Greek fire was a substance that burned on water. It could be projected from ships through bronze tubes as a liquid stream, or packed into clay pots and hurled by catapult, and when it made contact with anything, wood, cloth, enemy sailors in the water, it continued to burn even as it floated. Water did not extinguish it. In some formulations, it seemed to burn more fiercely when doused with water. Sand or vinegar were reported to smother it. Accounts of its use describe enemy fleets destroyed in minutes, ships going up, like torches, sailors jumping into the sea only to find the fire following them across the water. The composition of Greek fire is one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. The Byzantine state guarded the formula as one of its most important state secrets. The Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, writing in the 10th century, explicitly instructed his son never to reveal the formula to anyone, regardless of gifts or flattery or threats, claiming that it had been revealed to the first Christian emperor by an angel of God and would be taken away by divine judgment if shared with unworthy peoples. Whatever it contained, modern historians believe it was probably based on naphtha, a petroleum fraction, combined with quicklime or other ingredients that caused the mixture to ignite on contact with water. Some version of it was probably related to the natural petroleum seeps of the Caucasus region, which the Byzantines had access to through trade. Greek fire was first used in 678 CE, when an Arab fleet besieging Constantinople was destroyed by Byzantine fire ships equipped with the new weapon. The Arabs had brought the largest fleet that had yet appeared in the eastern Mediterranean, and they had been methodically blockading Constantinople for 4 years with the apparent intention of starving it into submission. Greek fire dissolved the Arab naval threat in a single engagement. The Arab fleet withdrew with enormous losses, and the Arabs subsequently paid a substantial tribute to Byzantium as part of the peace settlement. It was one of the most consequential naval battles in history, though it is far less famous than it deserves to be. The Byzantines used Greek fire again to even more decisive effect in 717 to 718 CE, when another Arab besieging force, this one combining a land army of reportedly 80,000 men with a fleet of 1,800 ships, attempted the second great Arab assault on Constantinople. Again, Greek fire destroyed the Arab fleet. Again, the siege was lifted. These two failed sieges of Constantinople were among the most important events in medieval history, because if either had succeeded, the entire subsequent history of Europe would have been different in ways that are impossible to fully calculate. But while Constantinople held, the rest of the Byzantine Mediterranean did not. Province by province, sea by sea, the empire lost ground to the expanding Arab world, and the story of how that happened takes us into one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of the sea. Nothing in the political and religious landscape of the 6th century CE suggested that the Arabian Peninsula was about to produce the most explosive expansion of power in the history of the ancient world. The Arabs of the peninsula were organized in tribes, not states. They had no imperial tradition, no professional army, no navy. The sea was alien to most of them. The nomadic Bedouin of the interior had virtually no contact with it, and even the settled communities of the coasts were traders and fishermen, not naval powers. And then, in the space of a single generation, everything changed. Muhammad ibn Abdullah died in 632 CE, having unified most of the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam and having set in motion a process of expansion that his successors would carry to the edges of the known world. Within 10 years of his death, the Arab armies had conquered Persia, one of the ancient world's great empires, had defeated Byzantine armies repeatedly in Syria and Palestine, had taken Jerusalem and Alexandria, and had begun the long process of absorbing Egypt, the richest province in the Mediterranean world. Within a century they had reached the Atlantic coast of Morocco and the Indus River, and Arab governors ruled from Spain to Central Asia. The conquest of Egypt in 641 to 642 CE was the moment when the Arab world acquired its Mediterranean ambitions. Egypt meant Alexandria. Alexandria meant a harbour, a shipbuilding, tradition, sailors with generations of Mediterranean experience, and access to the timber and materials needed to build warships. The Arab commanders who took Egypt were quick to understand what they had acquired, and within a decade of the conquest they had begun building a fleet. The first major Arab naval operation in the Mediterranean took place in 649 CE, when a fleet assembled in Alexandria under the governor of Syria, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, raided Cyprus. The island was wealthy, poorly defended, and geographically central, an ideal first target for a nascent naval power testing its capabilities. The raid was successful, and it established a pattern that would be repeated across the Mediterranean over the following century. Arab fleets striking coastal targets, establishing footholds on islands, disrupting Byzantine shipping, and gradually expanding the area of Arab influence from the eastern Mediterranean toward the centre of the sea. What was remarkable about Arab naval expansion is the speed with which a people with virtually no maritime tradition became competent and eventually formidable naval operators. Part of the explanation is simple. The Arab commanders recruited experienced sailors from the conquered provinces, Egyptians, Syrians, Phoenicians, Greeks, who knew the sea and its demands. But another part of the explanation is the qualities that had made Arab tribal warfare so effective: mobility, endurance, willingness to take risks, and a religious motivation that made death in the cause of the faith seem not a tragedy but a fulfillment. Arab sailors who went on naval expeditions considered themselves engaged in the same holy struggle as Arab soldiers who fought on land, and this gave their naval operations a morale advantage that pure professional calculation could not always match. The Battle of the Masts in 655 CE was the first great demonstration of Arab naval power against the Byzantines. A Byzantine fleet under the emperor, Constans II himself, the emperor's personal presence testifying to how seriously Constantinople took this threat, encountered an Arab fleet off the coast of Lycia in what is now southern Turkey. The battle was fought in conditions of near calm, which neutralized the maneuvering advantage that Byzantine ships might otherwise have had, and the Arabs apparently tied their ships together to create a stable fighting platform that their infantry could operate from as though it were solid ground. The Byzantine fleet was routed. The emperor escaped only by exchanging his robes with a common sailor, leaving the sailor to die in his place. It was a catastrophic defeat that demonstrated that Arab naval power was not a temporary phenomenon. The Arab advance continued. Sicily was raided, Sardinia was raided, the Aegean islands were raided. Crete was occupied for over a century from 827 to 961 CE, providing a pirate base from which Arab raiders struck at Byzantine shipping and coastal communities with devastating effect. Sicily was conquered more completely. The Arab conquest of the island took from 827 to 902 CE, a campaign conducted in a series of raids, landings, sieges, and local accommodations that slowly transformed the island from Byzantine into Arab territory. Arab Sicily was, by most historical accounts, a sophisticated and in many ways admirable civilization. The Arab rulers were generally tolerant of their Greek and Latin Christian subjects, allowing them to practice their religion and maintain their communities in exchange for the payment of the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. Agriculture was improved with the introduction of new crops: cotton, sugarcane, lemons, oranges, hard wheat, almonds, and new irrigation techniques. The cities of the island, particularly Palermo, became prosperous, cosmopolitan centres of trade and learning, where Arab, Greek, and Latin cultures interacted in complex and occasionally fruitful ways. Arab geographers wrote detailed descriptions of Sicily that demonstrate close observation and genuine curiosity about the island and its inhabitants. This Arab Mediterranean, literate, commercial, connected to the great Islamic civilization of Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo, was in many respects the most intellectually vital part of the Mediterranean world in the 9th and 10th centuries. While Europe north of the Alps was in what historians used to call the Dark Ages, though they have since retreated from that term as too simplistic, the Arab world was preserving and extending the Greek philosophical and scientific tradition, producing advances in mathematics and astronomy and medicine that Europe would not absorb until the 12th century. The Mediterranean in this period was not the centre of world civilization. That honour went to China and perhaps to the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. But it was far from moribund, and the Arab presence on it was the most dynamic force in the sea's history, since the Roman peace. Here is something that textbooks rarely mention, a fact that tends to produce surprise and then, on reflection, a kind of delight at the strangeness of history. Vikings raided the Mediterranean. Not in a small way, not accidentally, but in organised expeditions that reached the coasts of Spain, North Africa, southern France, and eventually Italy and perhaps even further. The Vikings, who are usually imagined attacking English monasteries, and founding Dublin also at various points, made war on Arab emirs in Spain, sacked cities on the Moroccan coast, attacked the Italian city of Pisa, and may have reached Constantinople, where some of their descendants would eventually serve as the emperor's elite bodyguard. The Norse expansion of the 8th through 11th centuries is usually told as a story of the North Atlantic and the North Sea, the raids on Britain and Ireland, the settlement of Iceland and Greenland, the discovery of North America 5 centuries before Columbus. But the Norse world was connected to the Mediterranean through several routes, and the boldest of their sailors and warriors did not stop at the edge of their familiar seas. The first major Norse incursion into the Iberian Peninsula occurred in 844 CE, when a fleet of perhaps 80 ships descended on the coast of what is now Portugal and Spain, raiding Lisbon, sailing up the Guadalquivir River to attack Seville, and making a general nuisance of themselves along the Atlantic coast of Iberia. The Arab rulers of Al-Andalus, the Arab name for Muslim Spain, were caught entirely off guard. Their land armies were formidable, but their naval defences of the Atlantic coast were minimal. The Norse raiders killed, enslaved, and plundered with the efficiency that made them feared across the known world, and then sailed away before a coordinated response could be organised. They came back. A second Norse expedition to Iberia in the 850s was considerably more ambitious. Under the leadership of 2 legendary Norse chieftains named Björn Ironside and Hastin, a fleet of approximately 62 ships sailed from the Loire River in what is now France, raided along the Iberian Atlantic coast, passed through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, raided the coast of Morocco, turned northeast along the Spanish Mediterranean coast, raided the Balearic Islands, crossed to southern France, raided there, crossed to the Italian coast, attacked Pisa, sailed further south, and eventually struck a city on the Italian coast that the Norse sources identify as Luna, which they apparently initially mistook for Rome. The confusion is perhaps forgivable. Luna was an impressive city, but the geographical error tells us something about the limits of Norse knowledge of Mediterranean geography. They had sailed 3,000 miles into an entirely unfamiliar sea on the basis of reputation, rumour, and the Norse conviction that wherever there was wealth, it was worth trying to take it. What is remarkable about the Björn Ironside and Hastin expedition is not just its distance. The round trip from the Loire to Italy and back was a voyage of perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 miles, but its duration. The fleet spent the better part of 3 years in the Mediterranean, wintering in the Rhone Delta, raiding systematically in the spring and summer, and returning with substantial plunder. The Norse ships, the famous longships, were supremely well adapted for this kind of extended raiding. They were shallow enough to navigate rivers, sturdy enough for open sea, fast under both oar and sail, and light enough to be dragged overland when necessary. They were the SUVs of the early medieval world, versatile, capable, and somewhat alarming to anyone who encountered them unexpectedly. The Norse connection to the Mediterranean was not only through raiding. The Varangian route, the river route from Scandinavia down through the great rivers of Russia to the Black Sea and thence to Constantinople, was a major commercial artery in the 9th and 10th centuries, along which Norse merchants traded slaves, furs, and amber for Byzantine silk, spices, and silver. Norsemen serving as mercenaries in Byzantine armies were called Varangians, and the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard composed primarily of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors, was one of the most feared military units in the Byzantine world. When the Byzantine emperor went into battle, he was surrounded by enormous blonde warriors with axes who were quite literally strangers in a strange land, their loyalties purchased and maintained by the extraordinary wealth of the empire they served. The Norse presence in the Mediterranean was always that of an outsider, raiders and mercenaries rather than colonizers or empire builders. The one lasting Norse impact on the Mediterranean world was indirect. The settlement of Normandy in northern France in the early 10th century, when a Norse chieftain named Rollo accepted baptism and a grant of land from the French king in exchange for defending the Seine Valley from further Norse raids. His descendants, the Normans, became thoroughly French in language and culture, but retained the Norse capacity for audacious military adventure, and in the 11th century they turned that capacity on both England and southern Italy, eventually establishing a kingdom in Sicily that was, like everything about Sicily, a complex and fascinating mixture of cultures. By the year 1000 CE, the Mediterranean was entering one of its most complex and commercially dynamic periods, an era in which the power to control the sea would no longer be measured primarily in warships and armies, but in something more subtle and ultimately more durable, the capacity to organize, finance, and profit from trade on a scale that previous civilizations had never attempted. The great Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Amalfi, were the architects of this transformation. They were city-states in the classical sense, politically independent, fiercely competitive with each other, and collectively responsible for what economic historians have called the commercial revolution of the medieval Mediterranean. Between roughly 1000 and 1350 CE, these cities developed the institutional technologies of capitalism: double-entry bookkeeping, maritime insurance, partnerships, bills of exchange, credit instruments of bewildering sophistication, and used them to dominate Mediterranean commerce with a thoroughness that recalled, in some ways, the Phoenicians at their height. Venice is the city that most fully embodies this transformation. Founded by refugees from the mainland who fled into the Adriatic lagoon to escape the barbarian invasions of the 5th and 6th centuries, Venice had turned its extraordinary isolation. An island city accessible only by water, with no agricultural hinterland, no mineral resources, essentially nothing but the lagoon and the sea, into the foundation of a commercial civilization. The lagoon that had once been a refuge became an asset. It was impenetrable to conventional military attack, and it sat at the head of the Adriatic Sea, the natural entry point for trade between the Mediterranean and the great river systems of northern Europe. Venice's relationship with the Byzantine Empire was the key to its early commercial success. The Byzantines, perpetually short of the naval power needed to defend their Adriatic and Aegean coastlines, gave Venice extraordinary trading privileges in exchange for naval assistance. By the 11th century, Venetian merchants were trading in Constantinople on more favourable terms than the Byzantines' own subjects, a situation that generated enormous resentment among Byzantine merchants, but that the imperial government maintained because it needed Venetian ships. The Arsenal of Venice, the great shipbuilding complex on the eastern edge of the island city, was one of the industrial wonders of the medieval world. At its height in the 14th and 15th centuries, it employed perhaps 16,000 workers and could produce a completed war galley in a single day through a proto-industrial assembly line process that astonished every visitor who saw it. Dante, who visited Venice in the early 14th century and saw the arsenal at work, used it as an image in the Inferno, comparing the boiling tar in which sinners are submerged to the pitch used to caulk ships in the arsenal. The comparison is telling. For a Florentine intellectual of the 14th century, the arsenal was so remarkable that it was the natural metaphor for the extraordinary. The Venetian galley was the signature vessel of Mediterranean commercial and military power in the medieval period. Unlike the ancient trireme, which was a pure warship, the Venetian war galley was also a merchant vessel, a hybrid that reflected the commercial nature of Venetian power. At peacetime, galleys transported the high-value goods, spices, silk, dyes, precious metals, that formed the backbone of Venetian prosperity. In wartime, the same ships served as naval vessels, their merchant crews becoming fighting men with minimal reorganization. The merchants who owned shares in the trading voyages were also, when necessary, the fighters who defended the cargo against pirates or enemy navies. Commerce and warfare were not separate spheres in Venetian culture, they were different expressions of the same underlying drive for profit and power. Genoa was Venice's great rival, and the competition between them shaped the medieval Mediterranean in ways that still echo. Where Venice was aristocratic, conservative, and carefully organized, the famous Council of Ten, the elaborate system of checks and balances that prevented any single family from accumulating too much power, Genoa was chaotic, entrepreneurial, and perpetually torn by factional violence. Where Venice maintained a state monopoly on the most profitable trading routes, Genoa encouraged individual enterprise, producing a generation of merchants and bankers who spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, establishing communities in Beirut, Alexandria, Constantinople, Crimea, and as far as China. The Genoese were perhaps the most purely commercial of all Mediterranean peoples, more thoroughly committed to the bottom line, more willing to work for whoever paid best, more likely to finance an enemy's fleet today if it generated profit, and an ally's tomorrow if that was where the advantage lay. When the Crusades began at the end of the 11th century, both Venice and Genoa moved quickly to secure commercial advantages from the new Christian states being established in the Levant. They were not primarily motivated by religious zeal, though they were not immune to it, but by the recognition that the Crusader states would need supplies, ships, and financial services, and that whoever provided these services most reliably would be in an excellent position to profit from the trade routes of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusades transformed the Mediterranean commercial world in ways that went far beyond the specific trading arrangements between Italian cities and Crusader states. They created a sustained demand for maritime transport that drove innovation in shipbuilding and navigation. They exposed European merchants to the luxury goods of the East, spices, silks, cotton fabrics, sugar, glassware, and created a permanent appetite for these products that would eventually drive European exploration of the world. They established networks of commercial intelligence, credit, and transport that survived the Crusades themselves and continued to shape Mediterranean commerce for centuries afterward. And they put enormous quantities of money and ships in the hands of the maritime republics, transforming Venice and Genoa from significant city-states into something approaching superpowers. The Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, was held in the heart of France, a landlocked country, in a landlocked city, before a predominantly landlocked audience. The knights and nobles who responded to Urban's call with cries of Deus vult, God wills it, were cavalrymen, fighters who thought in terms of horses and lances and fortified positions. Most of them had never commanded a ship or thought seriously about naval strategy. And yet, almost from the beginning, anyone with a clear eye could see that the success of the crusading enterprise depended entirely on the sea. The route from Western Europe to Jerusalem was long enough overland, through the Balkans, across Anatolia, through Syria and Palestine. But it was also dangerous, exposed, and logistically nightmarish for large armies. The sea route was faster and could carry larger quantities of supplies and reinforcements. More fundamentally, once the Crusader states were established in the Levant, their continued existence depended on the sea routes that connected them to Europe. Cut off those routes, and the Crusader states would wither and die, surrounded by hostile Muslim powers with no hope of relief. This reality shaped the entire history of the Crusades in ways that the popular imagination, which focuses on the heroic stories of individual knights and battles, tends to undervalue. The First Crusade succeeded partly because it arrived by land before the Levantine Muslim powers had time to organize a coordinated naval response. The subsequent Crusades increasingly recognized that ships were as important as soldiers, and the history of crusading financing is substantially the history of how European kingdoms negotiated with Italian maritime cities for the use of their fleets. The most dramatic example of this relationship, and the most revealing of its inherent tensions, was the Fourth Crusade of 1202 to 1204, which ended, not in Jerusalem but in Constantinople, the greatest betrayal of crusading ideology in the movement's history, and one of the most consequential events in medieval Mediterranean history. The story begins with a contract between the crusading army and Venice. The Crusaders, assembling in Venice in 1202, needed ships to transport approximately 33,500 men and their horses and equipment to Egypt, the target of this crusade, which intended to attack the Muslim heartland rather than Palestine directly. Venice agreed to provide the fleet for the astronomical sum of 85,000 silver marks, plus half of all conquests made during the campaign. The problem was that when the Crusaders actually arrived in Venice, there were only about a third as many of them as expected. The army was smaller than planned, and many Crusaders had made their own way to the east, rather than waiting in Venice. The reduced army could not pay the full contract price. The Venetians, who had spent an entire year reorganizing their commercial affairs to prepare the fleet and had lost enormous revenues by suspending normal trading operations during that time, refused to simply release the Crusaders from their obligation. Doge Enrico Dandolo, an elderly, nearly blind, but politically brilliant man who would prove to be one of the most consequential figures in medieval Mediterranean history, proposed a compromise. The Crusaders could pay off part of their debt by helping Venice recover the Adriatic city of Zara, which had defected to the King of Hungary and was now competition for Venetian commercial control of the Adriatic. The Crusaders, their options limited, agreed, and they attacked Zara, a city of Crusader Christians, on behalf of Venice. The Pope excommunicated the entire crusade, though he subsequently absolved the Crusaders if not the Venetians. What happened next was the consequence of a Byzantine dynastic dispute that had been simmering for years. A young Byzantine prince, named Alexios, came to the crusading army with a proposition: help him recover his father's throne, usurped by his uncle, and he would bring the Byzantine Church into submission to Rome, fund the crusade, and provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the campaign in Egypt. The combination of factors, the debt to Venice, the financial needs of the crusade, the prospect of solving the long-standing schism between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, proved irresistible to the crusading leadership and critically to Dandolo. The Fourth Crusade sailed to Constantinople, helped restore the young Alexios to a throne he could not actually hold. His uncle was quickly replaced by another usurper, and eventually, after a series of increasingly catastrophic diplomatic failures, attacked and captured Constantinople itself in April 1204. The sack that followed was, by the standards of the medieval world, extraordinarily thorough. 3 days of looting destroyed or dispersed art treasures, manuscripts, and relics that had been accumulating in Constantinople for 9 centuries. The bronze horses that now stand above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, ancient Roman works, possibly from the Hippodrome of Constantinople, were among the more tangible items that made the journey west. The Orthodox clergy, whose resistance to Rome had been one of the stated justifications for the diversion of the crusade, were despoiled of their churches and replaced by Latin bishops. For Venice, the sack of Constantinople was an unambiguous triumph. The treaty that divided the Byzantine Empire's territories gave Venice 3/8 of Constantinople, the island of Crete, and a string of ports and islands throughout the Aegean and Ionian seas. This territorial acquisition, which Dandolo negotiated with a precision that suggests he had been thinking about it for some time, gave Venice effective control of the sea routes between the Western Mediterranean and the Levant, transforming the city from a major commercial power into something approaching a maritime empire. Venetians called it the acquisition of a 1.25 of the Roman Empire, and they were not entirely wrong. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks on May 29, 1453, and the event sent a shockwave through the Mediterranean world that can still be felt in the cultural and political landscape of Europe today. The city that had been a Christian capital for over 1,000 years, that had been the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire and the guardian of Orthodox Christianity, was taken by storm after a siege that lasted 53 days by an army equipped with the largest cannon that had ever been constructed, firing stone balls that weighed over 500 kilograms. The Sultan who accomplished this was Mehmed II, known thereafter as Fatih, the Conqueror. He was 21 years old when he took Constantinople, and he had been preparing for this conquest since he had first held power, studying the city's defences, commissioning the giant cannon from a Hungarian gunsmith who had offered his services to both sides, and most importantly building a fleet large enough to support the siege from the sea. The Theodosian land walls that had held for 1,000 years were finally vulnerable to gunpowder artillery, but the sea walls required a different approach, and Mehmed's solution was characteristically audacious. The Byzantine defenders had stretched a great iron chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the inlet that formed the city's harbour, to prevent Ottoman ships from entering and attacking the sea walls. Mehmed responded by having his ships dragged over land on greased wooden runners, bypassing the chain and appearing in the Golden Horn at dawn. The Byzantines woke to find an Ottoman fleet inside their harbour. The psychological shock of this manoeuvre, so unexpected, so apparently impossible, was arguably as damaging as the military reality. Constantinople fell, and with it the last vestige of the Roman Empire. Mehmed promptly moved the Ottoman capital to Constantinople, renaming it Istanbul, though the old name persisted in informal use for centuries, and declared himself Caesar of Rome, a claim that amused or horrified Western Europeans but was not without historical logic. He had conquered Rome's city. He was entitled to Rome's title. More practically, he had acquired Rome's position, master of the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, controller of the eastern terminus of the great trade routes, heir to the commercial geography that had made Constantinople rich for 1,000 years. The Ottoman expansion into the Mediterranean was not simply a military phenomenon, it was also a commercial and naval one. The Ottomans understood that controlling the sea lanes meant controlling the wealth that flowed along them, and they invested heavily in building a naval infrastructure to match their ambitions. The great arsenals at Constantinople, at Gallipoli, and later at Sinop and Izmit became centres of shipbuilding comparable to the Venetian arsenal. Ottoman galley fleets, manned by a mix of professional sailors, Christian slaves working the oars, and Janissary soldiers fighting on deck, expanded rapidly through the latter half of the 15th century. The Ottomans also had the great advantage of geographic position. By holding Constantinople and the Dardanelles, they controlled the gate between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. By expanding along the Anatolian coast and eventually into Egypt and Syria, they gradually encircled the eastern Mediterranean. By allying with or incorporating the Muslim Corsair states of North Africa, they extended Ottoman naval influence westward across the Central Sea. The pressure on Christian maritime powers, Venice above all, was relentless. It was in this context that one of the most remarkable careers in Mediterranean naval history unfolded, that of Khayr ad-Din Barbarossa, the man who had come to be known simply as Barbarossa, Redbeard, by Europeans who feared him more than almost any other figure of the 16th century. Barbarossa was a Greek convert to Islam, or perhaps a Greek Muslim from birth, the sources disagree, who with his brother Arouj had built a pirate empire along the North African coast in the early 16th century, raiding Spanish and Italian ships and towns with a freedom that reflected the absence of any Christian naval power capable of stopping him. When his brother was killed by Spanish forces, Khayr ad-Din offered his kingdom to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I in exchange for support. The offer was accepted, and Barbarossa became the Ottoman admiral, combining his personal naval genius with the resources of the empire. The Barbarossa years, roughly 1533 to 1546, when he served as Ottoman admiral-in-chief, were a period of Ottoman naval dominance in the Mediterranean that no Christian power could effectively challenge. He raided the coasts of Italy repeatedly, enslaving populations, destroying ports, and demonstrating that no coastal community on the northern shore of the sea was safe. He defeated a combined Christian fleet off the coast of Greece at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, cementing Ottoman naval supremacy. He raided the Balearic Islands, sacked Nice, and in a move of almost theatrical audacity, spent the winter of 1543 to 1544 in Toulon, the French king's major Mediterranean naval base, as a guest of Francis I of France, who had formed an alliance with the Ottomans against their common enemy, the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. The sight of an Ottoman fleet wintering in a French port, with the port's Christian population temporarily expelled to accommodate Muslim sailors, was one of the most scandalous spectacles of the 16th century, a vivid demonstration of how thoroughly the old religious categories of Mediterranean politics had been scrambled by pragmatic self-interest. The morning of October 7th, 1571, found two fleets facing each other across the waters of the Gulf of Patras, off the western coast of Greece, in waters the ancients had called the Gulf of Corinth, and which the Christians of the 16th century were calling the Gulf of Lepanto. On one side, the Ottoman fleet under Ali Pasha, approximately 210 to 220 war galleys, 56 smaller vessels, perhaps 88,000 men in total, flying the crescent banner of the Sultan and confident in the naval tradition of an empire that had not lost a major sea battle in a generation. On the other side, the Holy League fleet under Don John of Austria, the illegitimate son of the Emperor Charles V, 26 years old, a man of legendary good looks and genuine military talent, approximately 206 galleys and 6 enormous galleasses, a new type of warship, larger and more heavily armed than conventional galleys, plus 30 smaller vessels and roughly 84,000 men. What was at stake was significant without being existential. The Ottoman victory the previous year at Cyprus, where the Venetian garrison had been massacred after a siege of almost a year, and where the Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin had been flayed alive on the orders of the Ottoman commander after the surrender, had shocked Christian Europe and produced one of those rare moments of genuine solidarity that usually eluded the fractious Christian monarchies. Spain, Venice, the papacy, and several smaller Italian states had formed the Holy League specifically to challenge Ottoman naval dominance, and the fleet assembled at Messina in the autumn of 1571 was the product of that alliance. The battle was decided within a few hours. Don John's decision to arm his galley slaves and have them fight rather than merely row, a calculated risk since armed galley slaves were a potential security problem as well as a military asset, gave the Christian fleet additional fighting men at a critical moment. The 6 galleasses deployed ahead of the main fleet disrupted the Ottoman line with their heavy artillery before the fleets closed to boarding range, and in the melee that followed, the Christian advantage in firearms, Spanish arquebus men were probably the best infantry in the world at the moment, proved decisive. Ali Pasha was killed in the fighting on his flagship, and his head was displayed on a pike above the Christian fleet, sending an unmistakable message to his troops and causing a catastrophic collapse of Ottoman morale. By afternoon, the battle was over. The Ottomans had lost approximately 210 ships, 50 sunk, 137 captured, and perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 men killed, with another 3,500 taken prisoner. The Holy League had lost approximately 7,500 men killed and perhaps 17 ships. More than 12,000 Christian galley slaves, many of them from countries throughout Europe, had been freed when the Ottoman ships were captured. The news of Lepanto was greeted with an explosion of relief and celebration across Catholic Europe. The Pope declared it a miracle. Church bells rang in every city of the Holy League. Poems, paintings, monuments, and commemorations multiplied across the continent. Don John became a hero of almost mythological stature. The young Spaniard Miguel de Cervantes, who was wounded at Lepanto and lost the use of his left hand, which he ever afterward considered a badge of honour, would later write Don Quixote, the first modern novel, and always referred to Lepanto as the greatest event he had ever witnessed. And yet, within a year, the meaning of Lepanto had become considerably more complicated. The Holy League failed to follow up its victory with any sustained offensive. Venice, the most capable naval partner, negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans that recognised Cyprus as Ottoman territory. The very island whose loss had prompted the formation of the League, the Ottomans, far from being broken by the defeat, built an entirely new fleet within a year, a demonstration of the Ottoman state's almost unimaginable productive capacity. When the new Ottoman admiral Kilich Ali Pasha encountered the Holy League fleet off the coast of Tunisia in 1572, he simply declined to engage, recognising that his new and largely inexperienced fleet was not yet ready for a major battle, and the moment passed without a decisive engagement. Lepanto was the end of an era rather than the beginning of a new Christian dominance of the Mediterranean. It was the last great battle fought entirely with oared galleys, the final engagement of the medieval naval tradition that had begun with the Athenian trireme and run through Byzantine dromons and Venetian war galleys to this culminating clash in the Gulf of Patras. Within a generation, sailing ships armed with cannon, a technology already dominating the Atlantic, would begin to replace the galley in Mediterranean warfare, and the strategic logic of the sea would shift accordingly. But on that October morning in 1571, the old world of Mediterranean naval power made its final, spectacular statement. The story of Mediterranean power in the 16th and 17th centuries is partly the story of Lepanto and the Ottoman Christian struggle. But it is also the story of something more gradual and more fundamental, the slow displacement of the Mediterranean from the centre of the world's commercial geography. This shift was not caused by any battle or any political decision, but by the convergence of technological development and geographical discovery that we call the Age of Exploration, and specifically by 2 voyages that changed the world. The first was Bartolomeo Dias's rounding of the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, which demonstrated for the first time that the Indian Ocean was accessible from the Atlantic, and that the long-dreamed-of sea route to the Spice Islands of Asia might actually be navigable. The second was Columbus's landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, which opened the Western Atlantic to European exploration and eventually produced the enormous flows of silver and gold from the Americas that would transform European capitalism in the 16th century. Both of these voyages were accomplished by Portuguese and Spanish sailors, people of the Atlantic coast, not the Mediterranean, who had spent generations developing the technology and techniques of ocean sailing in waters that were considerably more demanding than the Mediterranean. The ships they used, the Caravel and later the Carrack and Galleon, were deep-keeled, high-sided vessels capable of carrying large cargoes across thousands of miles of open ocean, vessels that could cope with the long swells and unpredictable storms of the Atlantic in ways that the shallow-drafted Mediterranean galley fundamentally could not. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in 1498, completing the voyage around Africa that Dias had pointed toward, the consequences for the Mediterranean were profound and in some ways catastrophic. The spice trade, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, cardamom, had been one of the Mediterranean's most valuable commercial arteries for centuries, flowing through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to the ports of Egypt and the Levant, and from there across the Mediterranean to the cities of Italy and beyond. The markup at each step of this journey was enormous, and the Italian city-states, particularly Venice, had made themselves enormously wealthy by controlling the last segment of the route from the Levant to the rest of Europe. When da Gama's ships returned to Lisbon with their holds full of spices purchased directly in India at a fraction of the overland price, the long-term implications were obvious to anyone who could count. The Venetians saw the threat clearly, and they lobbied the Ottoman Sultan to help them obstruct Portuguese trade in the Indian Ocean. The Ottomans, for their own reasons, did try to contest Portuguese naval dominance in the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, and for several decades in the early 16th century the Indian Ocean was the scene of a three-cornered struggle between Ottomans, Portuguese and various local rulers. But the Portuguese ultimately prevailed, establishing a chain of fortified trading posts from East Africa to the Spice Islands that gave them control of the sea route to Asia. The flow of silver from the Americas had equally profound effects on Mediterranean economies. Spanish silver, arriving in quantities that dwarfed anything Europe had previously known, flooded the Mediterranean commercial world and produced an extended period of inflation that disrupted the old commercial relationships on which Venice, Genoa and the other Italian city-states had built their wealth. The cities of the Mediterranean did not become poor overnight. Venice retained a vibrant commercial and artistic life well into the 17th century, and Genoa reinvented itself as a financial centre that financed much of Spain's imperial expenditure. But the trajectory was clearly downward, at least relative to the new Atlantic economies that were accumulating wealth at a faster rate. By the 17th century, the Mediterranean was no longer the centre of world commerce. That centre had shifted to the Atlantic ports, Lisbon, Seville, Antwerp, Amsterdam, London, where the great trading companies that were beginning to dominate global commerce had their headquarters and their warehouses. The Mediterranean was still important, still prosperous in parts, still contested by powerful states, but it was no longer the fulcrum of the world economy. That distinction it would not recover for 3 centuries. Even as the Mediterranean declined in commercial importance relative to the Atlantic, it remained intensely active as a theatre of conflict, and no aspect of that conflict was more disruptive to everyday life, for people on both shores of the sea, than the phenomenon of Barbary piracy, which flourished from the 16th century through the early 19th century and created a sustained state of insecurity for coastal populations from Iceland to the Levant. The Barbary corsairs, named for the Barbary coast, the Ottoman-affiliated states of what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia and Libya, were not simply criminals. They were, in the early period at least, state-sanctioned privateers operating under the legal framework of the Ottoman Empire and its North African clients, attacking ships and coastal communities of powers with which the Ottoman state was at war, which at various points meant most of Christian Europe. The distinction between piracy and privateering, between criminal violence for personal gain and state-sanctioned violence for political purposes, was always somewhat theoretical in practice, but it mattered legally and diplomatically in ways that shaped how the problem was addressed. The corsairs were extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily disruptive. At their peak in the 17th century, they were conducting raids not just on Mediterranean coastlines, but on Atlantic coasts as far north as Iceland. In 1627, an Algerian fleet under a Dutch renegade named Jan Janzoon known in his adopted Muslim world as Murat Reis the Younger, raided the coast of Iceland, capturing several hundred people and selling them into slavery in North Africa. In 1631, a raid on the Irish village of Baltimore captured the majority of the population, 107 men, women and children, and sold them in the slave markets of Algiers. The Irish writer T.C. Croker, writing in the 19th century, preserved a local tradition that a surviving woman of Baltimore would walk to the hilltop every day for the rest of her life, looking south toward the sea in the direction her family had been taken. The scale of North African slave-taking from Christian Europe between 1530 and 1780 has been estimated by the American historian Robert Davis at somewhere between 1 and 1.25 million people, a figure that contextualizes the Barbary trade in human terms that are often underemphasized in popular history. These were predominantly people from the coastal communities of Spain, Italy, France, Portugal, England, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Fishermen, sailors, merchants, coastal farmers, travellers, taken from their homes and transported to the slave markets of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Some were ransomed eventually through the efforts of religious orders that specialised in raising ransom funds, the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, whose missions across Catholic Europe collected money specifically for the redemption of North African captives. Most were not so fortunate. The Corsair states, Algiers above all, were also significant players in the broader geopolitics of the Mediterranean. The Dey of Algiers maintained substantial military power through the revenue generated by Corsair operations, and the Ottoman Empire found the Corsair states useful as a way of maintaining pressure on its Christian rivals without committing regular Ottoman forces to risky naval operations. European powers found themselves in the humiliating position of paying tribute to the Barbary states, effectively a protection fee that guaranteed their merchant ships would not be attacked, or of sending punitive naval expeditions that typically accomplished little beyond temporary disruption of Corsair operations. The United States of America had its first encounter with the Barbary problem almost immediately after independence. American merchant ships, previously protected by British treaties with the Barbary states, lost that protection when they became American rather than British vessels, and Barbary corsairs promptly began seizing American ships and enslaving American sailors. The payments of tribute that the early American government made to secure the release of captives became a significant political issue. Thomas Jefferson, among others, was deeply opposed to paying tribute that seemed to reward extortion, and eventually led to the First and Second Barbary Wars of 1801 to 1805 and 1815, in which the young American Navy conducted operations against Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli that produced agreements ending the payment of tribute and the enslavement of American citizens. The end of Barbary piracy as a systematic phenomenon came not through American naval action, but through French intervention. In 1830, France invaded Algeria ostensibly in response to a diplomatic insult. The Dey of Algiers had allegedly struck the French consul with a fly whisk during an argument about debt, but more fundamentally to eliminate a persistent irritant to French Mediterranean commerce and to find a political distraction from domestic troubles. The French invasion succeeded, the Dey was deposed, and France established what would become a colonial possession that it held for 132 years. It was the first major European colonial acquisition in the Mediterranean era, and it foreshadowed the broader pattern of European imperialism that would transform the sea's political geography in the 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte was 28 years old in 1798 when he proposed to the French Directory the most audacious strategic gamble of his early career, an expedition to Egypt. On the surface, it made a kind of imperial sense. Egypt controlled the land bridge between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and whoever held Egypt could theoretically threaten British India by opening an overland route. But Napoleon's motivations were characteristically complex and somewhat grandiose. He saw himself in the tradition of Alexander the Great, drawn to the East by visions of Oriental conquest. He was also, with the instinct of a genuine military genius, looking for a way to hurt Britain that did not require crossing the English Channel, which French naval weakness made essentially impossible. The Egyptian expedition of 1798 to 1801 is one of the most fascinating episodes in Mediterranean history, not primarily because of its military outcomes — it was ultimately a failure — but because of what it revealed about the Mediterranean's continuing cultural significance, and because of the extraordinary scientific enterprise that accompanied it. Napoleon brought with him not just an army of 38,000 men, but a commission of sciences and arts. 167 scientists, scholars, engineers, artists and intellectuals, representing virtually every field of knowledge in late 18th century Europe. This was unprecedented in military history. No conqueror had ever brought a research expedition along with his army, and it reflected Napoleon's understanding that knowledge was power in a very literal sense, and that understanding Egypt thoroughly was a prerequisite for exploiting it effectively. The scholars produced over the following years a monumental publication called the Description de l'Égypte, a multi-volume comprehensive survey of Egyptian natural history, archaeology, culture, and geography that remains one of the greatest scientific publications of the modern era. They mapped the Nile, catalogued Egyptian flora and fauna, described ancient monuments, and brought to European attention the full scope of pharaonic civilization in a way that had not previously been possible. The expedition's most famous discovery was made by a French soldier digging fortifications near the village of Rosetta, a large black basalt stone bearing the same text in 3 scripts, hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek, that would eventually allow the British scholar Thomas Young and the French scholar Jean-François Champollion to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics and unlock 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian written culture. The military side of the expedition, meanwhile, was undone almost entirely by the sea. Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding a British Mediterranean fleet, had been searching for the French expedition since it left Toulon. In May 1798, he missed it twice, once narrowly, before finally locating the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay at the mouth of the Nile on August 1st, 1798. What followed was the Battle of the Nile, one of the most decisive naval victories in British history and one of the most complete naval disasters in French history. Nelson attacked at dusk, taking the calculated risk that some of his captains would sail their ships between the French fleet and the shore, a manoeuvre that required extraordinary nerve, since the waters inside the French anchorage had not been charted and might have hidden sandbanks that would ground the British ships. The risk paid off. British ships on both the landward and seaward sides of the French fleet. The French were caught in a devastating crossfire. The French flagship L'Orient, one of the largest ships in the world, carrying a substantial portion of the treasure looted from Malta, caught fire and exploded at approximately 10 in the evening, in an explosion so loud that it was reportedly heard in Alexandria, 15 miles away. The silence that followed the explosion lasted several minutes as both sides absorbed what had happened. By morning, virtually the entire French fleet was destroyed or captured. Napoleon's army was isolated in Egypt, without supply lines or the possibility of reinforcement, dependent on the land it occupied for everything it needed. The expedition limped on for 2 more years before the French eventually evacuated, but it had no hope of achieving its strategic objectives. The Mediterranean had once again demonstrated its essential lesson. Without naval power, land power in the Mediterranean was ultimately futile. Napoleon learned this lesson thoroughly. His subsequent career was characterized by an acute awareness of British naval dominance and an increasingly desperate search for ways to circumvent it. Trafalgar in 1805, where Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets off the Cape. Of Cape Trafalgar ended any realistic prospect of French naval challenge to Britain and condemned Napoleon to a purely continental strategy. He could conquer most of Europe. He could never win the sea, and without the sea, his empire was always vulnerable to the British capacity to land armies anywhere on the European coastline and supply them indefinitely. The Mediterranean, which Napoleon had tried to make French, remained in practical terms a British lake. British dominance of the Mediterranean in the 19th century was not planned in advance. No imperial project of that scale ever is, but it was pursued with consistency and protected with tenacity once it became clear how much was at stake. The foundation of British Mediterranean power rested on 3 territorial acquisitions that together gave Britain control over the sea's essential choke points: Gibraltar at the western entrance, Malta at the central position between the eastern and western basins, and eventually Suez, which controlled the connection to the Red Sea and through it to India. Gibraltar was taken from Spain in 1704, during the War of the Spanish Succession, by a combined Anglo-Dutch force that recognized immediately the strategic significance of the rock. It sits at the narrowest point of the Strait of Gibraltar, where Europe and Africa are separated by only 14 kilometres, and whoever holds it controls the passage between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The Spanish tried repeatedly to take it back, most notably in the Great Siege of Gibraltar from 1779 to 1783, which lasted 3 years and 9 months, and failed comprehensively despite Spanish and French efforts. Gibraltar has been British ever since, a fact that continues to generate diplomatic friction with Spain, but that reflects the British strategic calculation that has remained consistent for 3 centuries. Malta fell to Britain in 1800, somewhat more accidentally. The island had been the headquarters of the Knights of St. John, the Knights Hospitaller, since the 16th century when the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent expelled them from Rhodes. Napoleon had taken Malta en route to Egypt in 1798, but the garrison he left behind proved both incompetent and abusive, and the Maltese population rose in revolt, appealing to Britain for help. The British blockade of the island eventually forced the French garrison to surrender in 1800, and although the Treaty of Amiens in 1802 technically required Britain to return Malta to the Knights, Britain found various reasons not to do so, and the island remained British until 1964, when it became independent. Malta's strategic significance in the central Mediterranean was, if anything, greater than Gibraltar's. It sits at the narrowest point of the Mediterranean, where Sicily and the African coast are closest, the same choke point that had made it a prize worth fighting over since the Phoenicians. Its harbour, the Grand Harbour at Valletta, was one of the finest natural harbours in the Mediterranean, deepened and developed by the Knights into a facility capable of handling the largest warships. As a coaling station for steam-powered warships, a function that became critical after the introduction of steam propulsion in the 1820s and 1830s, Malta was invaluable. Every British squadron operating in the Mediterranean needed Malta the way a traveller needs a reliable inn, a place to refuel, repair, rest and reorganise. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869 after 10 years of construction by the engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps and his Egyptian-backed company, transformed the strategic geography of the entire Eastern Hemisphere. For the first time in history, a ship could sail from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, without going around Africa, a journey that saved approximately 7,000 kilometres compared to the Cape route. For Britain, which depended on India as the centrepiece of its empire, the canal was not merely convenient, it was existential. The route through Suez reduced the journey from London to Bombay from several months to approximately 3 weeks. The canal made British India, in practical logistical terms, 3 times closer to the home islands than it had been before. Britain moved quickly to secure control of the canal. When the Egyptian Khedive Ismail, financially overextended after years of ambitious development projects, put his shares in the Suez Canal Company on the market in 1875, the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli arranged a personal loan of £4 million from the Rothschild banking house. Parliament was not in session, and there was no time to seek formal approval, and purchased the shares, giving Britain a 44% stake in the Canal Company. It was a pure act of strategic opportunism, executed with a swiftness that Doge Dandolo would have recognised and appreciated. The full occupation of Egypt followed in 1882 when a nationalist military movement under Colonel Arabi threatened to take control of the Egyptian government and potentially challenge British influence over the canal. A British naval bombardment of Alexandria and a subsequent military campaign crushed the Arabi movement and established British control over Egypt that would last in various forms until 1956. The British position in the Mediterranean was now comprehensive. Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, occupied in 1878, Egypt, and the Suez Canal. The sea that had been Roman, Arab, Byzantine, Ottoman, and contested between a dozen powers was now, more thoroughly than it had been since the Roman peace, under the control of a single imperial power. The Mediterranean in the 20th century was not peaceful for very long. The British control that had seemed so solid in 1900 was challenged almost immediately by the ambitions of a unified Italy, which had completed its national unification in 1870 and was determined to establish itself as a Mediterranean power commensurate with its geographical position and its imperial aspirations. Italy's self-image in this period was powerfully shaped by memory. The memory of Rome, above all, the conviction that the nation that sat on the ruins of the greatest Mediterranean empire in history had some kind of hereditary right to dominate the sea that Rome had called its own. This nostalgia for Roman greatness would drive Italy into some of the worst catastrophes of its modern history, beginning with the First World War, which Italy entered in 1915 on the Allied side partly in exchange for promises of territory on the Dalmatian coast and in the eastern Mediterranean, and ending with Mussolini's disastrous attempt to rebuild the Roman Empire in Africa and the Mediterranean in the 1930s and 1940s. But the Mediterranean's most catastrophic baptism in 20th century warfare came even before Italy's entry into the First World War. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 to 1916, the Allied attempt to force the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, was one of the largest and most costly amphibious operations in history up to that point, and its failure sent ripples through British strategic thinking that lasted for decades. The idea behind Gallipoli was straightforward in concept, though hideously complex in execution. The Western Front in France had settled into the murderous stalemate of trench warfare, and some British strategists, most prominently Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty, argued that the answer was to attack Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire, at its most vulnerable point. Force the Dardanelles, sail into the Sea of Marmara, threaten Constantinople, and the Ottomans would have to sue for peace. Knock the Ottomans out of the war, open a supply route to Russia through the Black Sea, and the strategic situation would transform. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a catastrophe of planning, execution and command that cost the British Empire and its Dominion partners, most heartbreakingly, Australia and New Zealand, approximately 56,000 men killed and 130,000 more wounded, sick or taken prisoner. The naval attempt to force the Dardanelles with battleships alone, in March 1915, failed when 3 capital ships were sunk by mines in a single day. The subsequent landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April degenerated immediately into a smaller-scale version of the Western Front, with both sides digging in on narrow strips of land swept by fire from 3 directions. After months of futile frontal assaults and counter-assaults, the Allies evacuated into January 1916, the evacuation being the most successfully executed part of the entire operation. Gallipoli's legacy in the Mediterranean was mixed. The defeat reinforced the lesson, already taught so many times throughout history, that the Dardanelles was not easily forced from the sea. But it also opened the wider Middle Eastern theatre, where British and Arab forces eventually dismantled the Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces, creating the political map of the modern Middle East in a series of decisions and promises. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the various agreements with Arab leaders, whose consequences are still playing out. The Second World War in the Mediterranean was a conflict of extraordinary complexity and strategic significance, fought simultaneously as a naval war, an air war, and a land war across a theatre that stretched from Gibraltar to the Levant and from the Italian Alps to the Sahara. For Britain, the Mediterranean was not a sideshow. It was, for much of the war's middle period, the primary theatre of British offensive operations, the place where the army of a global empire was trying to find a way to hurt Germany and Italy without yet having the capacity to attempt a direct assault on the European continent. The central figure of the Mediterranean naval war was Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the British Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, whose aggressive style and tactical boldness won a series of engagements that established British naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean despite Italian numerical superiority. At Cape Matapan in March 1941, Cunningham's fleet, guided by intelligence derived from broken Italian naval codes, ambushed and destroyed an Italian cruiser squadron at night, sinking 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers with no British losses. At Taranto in November 1940, British carrier-based aircraft launched a night attack on the Italian fleet at anchor in its home port, sinking 3 battleships and demonstrating for the first time in history that carrier aircraft could achieve decisive results against capital ships in harbour. A lesson that Japanese Admiral Yamamoto studied carefully in planning the attack on Pearl Harbor 13 months later. But the Mediterranean War also produced some of the most costly British naval defeats of the conflict. The fall of Crete in May 1941, where German paratroopers overwhelmed the British and Commonwealth garrison, was followed by the Royal Navy's agonising evacuation under constant Luftwaffe attack, during which 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers were sunk and 2 battleships, a carrier, and numerous other ships were damaged. Admiral Cunningham, ordered to evaluate whether the Navy could sustain the losses required to evacuate the army from Crete, gave his answer in words that recall the best traditions of British naval culture. "It takes 3 years to build a ship, but 300 years to build a tradition." The evacuation continued. Malta became the most bombed place on Earth in 1942, surpassing even London during the Blitz. Axis aircraft, German and Italian, flew over 3,000 sorties against the island in April 1942 alone, dropping more bombs in that single month than had fallen on London during the entire Blitz. The Maltese civilian population endured with extraordinary fortitude. King George VI awarded the island the George Cross, the highest civilian honour in the British system, in April 1942, and the island's airfields and harbour, though repeatedly devastated, were repeatedly repaired and continued to serve as a base for British operations against Axis supply lines to North Africa. The North African campaign, from El Alamein in 1942 through the Tunisian campaign that ended in May 1943 with the surrender of 275,000 Axis prisoners, was in many ways a naval and logistical campaign as much as a land one. Both sides depended entirely on supplies delivered by sea and British success in disrupting Axis supply lines through submarine warfare, air attacks and surface actions was as important as any desert battle in determining the outcome. When the North African campaign ended and the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, the Mediterranean was once again, as it had been for the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Byzantines and all the powers before them, the decisive theatre on which civilization's fate was being contested. The end of the Second World War found the Mediterranean in a condition of political exhaustion and imperial transition. Britain, which had dominated the sea for a century and a half, was financially depleted, its empire beginning to fragment, its capacity to maintain the military presence required for Mediterranean hegemony increasingly questionable. The United States, which had emerged from the war as the dominant Western power, was about to step into the vacuum, not with the enthusiasm of an imperial conqueror but with the reluctant necessity of a power that had concluded it had no choice. The moment of decision came in February 1947, when the British government informed the Truman administration that it could no longer financially sustain its military commitments in Greece and Turkey, 2 countries where communist insurgencies, backed or at least encouraged by the Soviet Union, threatened to bring left-wing governments to power. The British note was, in effect, a formal transfer of Mediterranean hegemony from one Anglophone power to another, and the Truman administration's response, the Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947, pledging American support to free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, transformed the American role in the Mediterranean from a wartime expedient to a permanent commitment. The Soviet Union's interest in the Mediterranean was as old as the Russian state's desire for warm water ports, a desire that had driven Russian foreign policy toward the Black Sea and the Turkish Straits for centuries, and that the Soviet regime inherited and intensified. The strategic logic was simple and compelling. Russia's geography gave it no natural warm water, ice-free naval access to the world's oceans. The Baltic froze in winter, so did the far northern ports. The Pacific coast was remote from Russia's political and economic centre of gravity. The Black Sea was warm, but access to the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles was controlled by Turkey, a NATO member. The dream of a warm water port with free access to the open ocean, and specifically to the Mediterranean, was a constant thread in Soviet strategic thinking. The Soviet Union pursued Mediterranean access through multiple avenues during the Cold War. It provided military assistance and political support to Arab nationalist governments, Egypt under Nasser, Syria, Libya after Gaddafi's 1969 coup, in exchange for basing rights and political alignment. Soviet naval vessels began appearing in the Mediterranean in the 1960s, establishing a permanent presence that challenged American naval dominance and provided the Arab allies with a visible protector. Soviet submarines, surface ships, and naval aircraft exercised throughout the Mediterranean with increasing frequency and confidence. The Six-Day War of June 1967, in which Israel defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 6 days of fighting, had profound Mediterranean implications. Soviet prestige, closely identified with the Arab cause, took a severe blow. American support for Israel solidified. The strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean shifted in favor of the American-Israeli alignment that would characterize the region for the following decades. When Egypt subsequently expelled its Soviet military advisors in 1972, a decision by President Sadat that reflected Egyptian frustration with Soviet caution and Soviet desire to control Egyptian military decision-making, the Soviet position in the Mediterranean contracted significantly. The Cold War Mediterranean was also shaped by NATO's southern flank. The alliance's attempt to maintain a coherent defensive posture along the Mediterranean coast of Europe that included awkwardly both Greece and Turkey, two countries with deep historical grievances against each other that occasionally threatened to come to blows. The Cyprus crisis of 1974, when Turkey invaded Cyprus following a Greek Cypriot coup backed by the Greek military junta, brought NATO's southern partners to the edge of open war and demonstrated the fragility of alliances built on competing national interests. Cyprus remains divided today along the line established by that 1974 intervention, a frozen conflict that the Mediterranean has absorbed, as it has absorbed so many other conflicts without resolution. Standing at the edge of the third decade of the 21st century and looking out at the Mediterranean, one is struck first by how familiar the questions are and how different the answers have become. The sea is still contested. It may be the most persistently contested body of water in the history of the world, but the nature of the contestation has shifted in ways that would baffle many of the historical figures we have been following tonight. The formal military supremacy in the Mediterranean belongs to NATO, and within NATO to the United States. The US Sixth Fleet, headquartered in Naples, Italy, has maintained a more or less continuous presence in the Mediterranean since 1946, and the network of American and NATO bases in Italy, Spain, Greece, Turkey, and elsewhere gives the alliance an infrastructure of Mediterranean power that would be the envy of Augustus Caesar or Mehmed the Conqueror. No power can challenge this military superiority in conventional terms, and no power is currently trying to. But military supremacy is not the same as control, and the Mediterranean in the 21st century illustrates this distinction more clearly than at almost any previous moment in its history. The sea is simultaneously subject to one power's military dominance and intensely contested along multiple other dimensions: economic, political, demographic, environmental. That military force addresses only partially. Russia's return to the Mediterranean, after the Soviet collapse that seemed to end its presence definitively, has been one of the most striking geopolitical developments of the early 21st century. The Syrian civil war that began in 2011 gave Russia the opportunity it had been seeking, a failing state that needed Russian military intervention to survive, and that was prepared to pay for that intervention with permanent basing rights. Russia's naval facility at Tartus in Syria, the only Russian naval base on the Mediterranean, is modest by the standards of American infrastructure in the region, but its symbolic significance is enormous. Russia has its warm water port. The warm water dream that has driven Russian foreign policy for centuries has been, at least partially, fulfilled. Turkey's relationship with the sea has become one of the most complex and consequential questions in contemporary Mediterranean geopolitics. Turkey controls the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the same strategic position that Constantinople has always provided, and it has used that control as one element of a broader assertion of Turkish interests in the Mediterranean that goes by the name of the Blue Homeland Doctrine. Under this doctrine, Turkey claims extensive areas of the eastern Mediterranean as Turkish continental shelf, in direct conflict with the claims of Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and Libya. Turkish warships and drilling vessels have operated in disputed waters, producing confrontations with Greek and Cypriot vessels, and with European Union member states that take the opposite view of where maritime boundaries lie. The Eastern Mediterranean, never truly settled, is unsettled again. The discovery of enormous natural gas reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant Basin, the Nile Delta, the waters around Cyprus, has added a new dimension of material interest to these old territorial disputes. Trillions of cubic feet of natural gas lie beneath the seafloor, and the question of who owns that gas is inseparable from the question of where maritime boundaries run, which is inseparable from the older questions of sovereignty and power that have been contested on this sea since the Phoenicians first sailed west in search of trade. The migration crisis that has made the Mediterranean surface a daily theatre of human tragedy since approximately 2011 is perhaps the most visible manifestation of the sea's enduring role as a boundary, a barrier, and a crossing point. Millions of people from Syria, Libya, Sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places of crisis and desperation have attempted the crossing from the southern shore to the northern shore, many of them in inadequate vessels that have sunk with enormous loss of life. The International Organization for Migration estimates that more than 25,000 people have died attempting the Mediterranean crossing since 2014, a figure that represents one of the largest ongoing humanitarian disasters in the world, almost invisible to many of the people who live on the sea's northern shore. This human crossing is in one sense entirely new, a product of modern economic inequality, of state failure in the Middle East and Africa, of the specific political crises of the early 21st century. But in another sense it is entirely familiar. The Mediterranean has always been a crossing point for people in motion, from the Phoenician traders to the Greek colonists to the Arab conquerors, to the Crusaders to the Jewish communities expelled from Spain in 1492 to the Huguenots fleeing France. The sea has never cared who crosses it, and it has always extracted a price from those who underestimate it.